Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxation Bedtime History. Tonight we step quietly into the soft grey morning of rural Ireland in the early 1840s, long before the world fully understands the shadow that is about to fall across the countryside. You wake to the gentle chill of damp air creeping through the thatched roof above you. Outside, mist hangs low over the green hills like a thin blanket. Somewhere nearby, a rooster calls out as if announcing the start of another ordinary day. At first glance, everything feels peaceful, steady, almost timeless. But here is the small reality check you probably did not ask for. If you are living here in 1845, there is a very real chance that you will not survive the decade. Sleep well with that comforting thought. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, feel free to share where you are watching from and what the local time is where you are. It is always fascinating to see where these quiet little bedtime journeys reach around the world. Now, dim the lights. The first thing you notice when you open the low wooden door of your cottage is the smell of damp earth mixed with smoke. It is not unpleasant exactly, it is simply the smell of life here. Peat smoke drifts lazily from nearby chimneys, curling slowly into the pale morning sky. The ground beneath your feet is cool and slightly muddy, because in Ireland the earth always seems to remember the last rain. You stretch listening to the soft sounds of the countryside waking around you. A cow shifts in the distance. Somewhere a dog barks once and then settles again. The wind rustles quietly through hedges and low stone walls that divide the fields into rough patches of farmland. In this part of Ireland, life follows rhythms that feel ancient. The sun rises, work begins, meals are simple, night falls, and the pattern repeats day after day, year after year. You step out onto the narrow path in front of your cottage. The building behind you is small, built from rough stone and mud with a thick roof of straw thatch. Smoke leaks gently from the hole in the roof, where the hearth fire breathes out its warmth. It is not large by any modern standard. Inside there is usually one room, perhaps two if fortune has smiled on the family, yet this tiny space holds everything: sleeping, cooking, eating, living. Across the fields you can already see neighbours beginning their morning routines. A man bends over a patch of soil with a wooden-handled spade. A woman carries a bucket of water carefully balanced against her hip. A pair of children chase one another along a narrow dirt path, their laughter briefly cutting through the quiet morning air. One well-established historical reality of rural Ireland at this time is that a huge portion of the population lives on very small plots of land, often rented from large estate owners. Many families farm just a few acres, or even less. These plots are barely enough to support them, yet somehow, generation after generation has managed to survive here. And the reason, as you will soon discover, lies mostly beneath the soil. But before we reach that story, take a moment to simply stand in the morning light. The land around you is lush in a way that almost seems unfair considering what is coming. Rolling green fields stretch toward distant hills that fade into morning mist. Stone fences crisscross the landscape like rough grey stitching holding the countryside together. If you listen carefully, you might hear the faint splash of water from a nearby stream. Ireland is full of them. Small rivers winding through fields carrying rainwater toward the sea. You walk slowly down the narrow lane, nodding quietly to a neighbour passing by with a cart. People here know each other well. Villages and farming communities are tightly woven webs of family, cousins, distant relatives, and long familiar faces. There is comfort in that closeness. When life becomes difficult, people rely on one another. And life, even before the famine arrives, is not exactly easy. Most families rise early because there is work waiting in the fields. Crops must be tended, animals must be fed, fences must be repaired, peat must be cut and dried for fuel. Every day brings its own quiet list of small necessary tasks. The tools you see around you are simple: wooden ploughs, iron spades, worn baskets woven from reeds. Farming here has not changed very much for generations. There is also a small, curious detail that visitors sometimes notice. Many Irish cottages during this time share space with animals. A pig might sleep close to the hearth during cold nights. Chickens wander in and out of the doorway with little concern for personal boundaries. It might sound odd today, but it actually serves a practical purpose. Animals provide warmth. In winter, that extra warmth can make the difference between comfort and bitter cold. Scholars still debate exactly how fragile rural Irish life had become by the early 1840s. Some historians argue that the system of land division and tenant farming had pushed families dangerously close to the edge long before the famine began. Others believe that although life was poor, the rural economy had developed ways to sustain its population, at least for a time. Standing here in the morning mist, it is hard to imagine the scale of the crisis that will soon unfold. Right now, the countryside still feels alive. You walk toward the edge of a nearby field where rows of plants stretch across the dark soil. Dew clings to their leaves, sparkling faintly as the rising sun begins to break through the clouds. A farmer kneels beside the rows, pressing soil gently around the base of the plants. He glances up and offers a small nod before returning to his work. These plants might not look like much. Green leaves, simple stems, quiet growth beneath the soil. But they hold an enormous secret. For millions of people across Ireland, these plants represent food survival and stability all at once. Beneath the earth grow potatoes, large, filling, dependable potatoes that have quietly become the foundation of daily life. A single acre planted carefully can feed an entire family for a year. That simple fact has shaped everything about life here. It explains why families can survive on such small plots of land. It explains why villages can grow larger even when farmland remains limited. It explains why meals, simple though they are, often leave people satisfied at the end of a long day. Boiled potatoes, perhaps a little milk if the family owns a cow, sometimes cabbage or onions from the garden. It is not fancy cuisine, but it works, at least for now. There is one more small curiosity that travellers sometimes mention in letters from this period. Many rural Irish people are known for surprising physical strength despite their simple diet. Potatoes are remarkably nutritious, containing vitamins, minerals, and calories in a compact form. Of course, nobody here is calculating nutritional charts. They simply know that the potato keeps them full. And so the fields around you are filled with them, rows upon rows stretching across the green countryside. Quiet, dependable, ordinary. You breathe in the cool morning air and watch the farmer working carefully in the soil. If you could see the future from this quiet moment, you might notice that everything about this peaceful landscape depends on a single fragile thread. But right now, the day is just beginning. The sun rises slowly over the hills. The mist begins to lift, and the fields of Ireland continue growing silent and green beneath the soft morning light. You linger near the edge of the field as the morning grows brighter. The mist that once hugged the ground is slowly dissolving, revealing the gentle curves of farmland, stretching toward distant hills. Dew still clings to the leaves of the plants around you, and when the breeze moves through them, the droplets shimmer briefly in the sunlight. At first glance, this landscape seems endlessly generous. The soil is dark and soft beneath your boots. Grass grows thick along the edges of the fields. Stone walls snake across the countryside like quiet boundaries between neighbours who have known each other for generations. But when you look more closely, something else becomes clear. Almost every patch of cultivated earth you see holds the same crop: potatoes. You step carefully between the rows, noticing how evenly spaced the plants are. Their green leaves spread low and wide, forming a dense blanket over the soil. Beneath that blanket, hidden safely underground, are the thick tubers that will soon be pulled from the earth and boiled for supper. For people living in Ireland during the early 19th century, the potato has quietly become the centre of life itself. One widely accepted historical reality is that by the 1840s, a large portion of Ireland's rural population depends almost entirely on potatoes for daily nourishment. For many labourers and tenant farmers, the potato provides most of their calories throughout the year. It grows well in Ireland's damp climate. It produces large harvests even on small plots of land. And perhaps most importantly, it fills the stomach in a way that simple grains often cannot. You crouch down and scoop a handful of soil into your palm. It crumbles easily, rich and slightly moist. Perfect potato soil. Nearby, a woman is already harvesting from an earlier planting. She pushes her spade into the ground with practiced ease, turning the soil and revealing several pale potatoes resting just beneath the surface. She gathers them into a rough basket, brushing off clumps of dirt with quick movements of her hands. When she notices you watching, she smiles faintly and lifts one of the potatoes. "Breakfast," she says with quiet humour. You can almost imagine the meal already. A pot hanging over the hearth fire, water slowly bubbling, potatoes softening until their skins split open, perhaps a little salt if the household is lucky, maybe a cup of milk beside it. It may not sound like much by modern standards, but for families here it is dependable nourishment. And dependable food means survival. The potato did not always hold such an important place in Irish life. It first arrived in Europe from the Americas centuries earlier, gradually spreading across different countries. In Ireland, it found almost ideal growing conditions: cool temperatures, frequent rain, soft soil that allowed the tubers to grow large beneath the ground. Over time, more and more families began planting potatoes as their main crop. This shift changed everything. Small plots of land that once struggled to produce enough grain could now feed entire households. Families that might once have faced constant hunger suddenly had a crop capable of sustaining them year after year. Villages grew larger, the population expanded. You can see the result of that quiet agricultural revolution all around you. Cottages dot the hillsides more densely than they did a century earlier. Narrow paths connect clusters of homes where extended families live within walking distance of one another. Children run between the fields, their bare feet quick against the damp grass. But there is a hidden vulnerability in this system. Nearly everyone relies on the same crop. The variety of potato most widely grown here is known today as the lumper. It is not famous for its taste or beauty. The potatoes are often irregular in shape and sometimes rather plain looking. Yet farmers value it for a very practical reason. It produces large harvests even in poor soil. If you were walking through these fields in the evening, you might see families gathering their potatoes into sacks or wooden barrels. A single acre planted well can produce enough food to sustain a household for months. That simple truth explains why so many Irish families depend on potatoes so completely. You notice a group of children nearby digging in the soil with small sticks. They are searching for leftover potatoes missed during the main harvest. When one child uncovers a small one, he holds it up proudly as if it were treasure. In a way it is. Meals in rural Ireland during this period are simple but filling. A typical day might begin with boiled potatoes and milk. Midday might bring more potatoes, perhaps mashed slightly, and mixed with cabbage. Evening supper often repeats the same meal again. It may sound repetitive, but the potato contains an impressive combination of nutrients. Many labourers manage to remain strong and healthy despite the limited variety of their diet. There is a curious detail travellers sometimes record when describing Irish rural life. Some visitors are surprised by the physical endurance of farm workers who live largely on potatoes and milk. Long days of digging, carrying and ploughing are powered by meals that appear simple but deliver steady energy. Of course, nobody here is analysing protein content or vitamin levels. They simply know that the potato works. Yet beneath the quiet confidence surrounding this crop lies a question that scholars still debate today. Some researchers suggest that Irish agriculture had become dangerously dependent on a single variety of potato by the 1840s. Others argue that farmers had survived occasional crop diseases before and believed their system was resilient enough to recover from temporary setbacks. Standing here among the rows, it is difficult to imagine that something could threaten such a reliable plant. The leaves look healthy, the stems are sturdy, the soil beneath them feels rich and promising. You walk farther along the field and notice a farmer carefully inspecting the plants. He runs his fingers across the leaves, turning them over as if checking for insects. His expression is thoughtful but not worried. Farmers here always watch their crops closely. Rainfrost, insects and soil conditions all play their part in determining the size of the harvest. But nothing in this calm morning suggests catastrophe. A breeze passes through the field, making the leaves rustle softly like quiet whispers. You pause and listen. In the distance, you hear the steady clink of metal as another farmer sharpens his spade against a stone. The rhythm is slow and patient. Work will continue all day. Beyond the fields, smoke still drifts lazily from cottage chimneys. Somewhere a woman calls for her children to come back inside before breakfast grows cold. Life continues with gentle familiarity. Yet the story of the potato holds one more strange detail that people at the time rarely consider. Because so many farmers plant the same variety year after year, the plants are almost identical to one another. They are grown not from seeds but from pieces of the previous year's crop. In modern terms, you might say the fields are filled with clones. It is an efficient system, but it carries a hidden weakness. If a disease ever appears that can attack this particular potato, every field could become vulnerable at once. Of course, no one standing here in the early 1840s is thinking about such possibilities. The farmers see only healthy green leaves stretching across the landscape. You brush a little dirt from your hands and glance across the wide Irish countryside. Rows of potatoes ripple gently in the wind. They look strong, reliable, permanent. But deep beneath the calm surface of this peaceful morning, the fragile foundation of life here is already waiting to be tested. The sun climbs a little higher as the morning settles into its usual rhythm. The mist has lifted completely now, leaving the countryside bright and gently alive with quiet movement. You wander along the narrow dirt lane between fields, your boots brushing against damp grass. Birds hop along the hedges pecking for insects, while the distant clatter of farm tools drifts lazily through the air. For the moment, everything appears exactly as it should. The potato plants sway softly in the breeze, their broad leaves catching the sunlight. Farmers move through the fields with steady, practiced motions, digging, tending, inspecting. It is the same routine repeated year after year. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. And yet somewhere among these fields, something small and almost invisible has already begun. You notice the first hint of it when you reach another patch of farmland a short walk from the village. A farmer stands quietly beside a row of potato plants, his brow slightly furrowed as he bends closer to examine the leaves. You approach slowly, curious. At first you see nothing unusual. The plants still look green and healthy from a distance, but when you crouch beside him and look more closely, the difference becomes clearer. A few leaves are speckled with dark patches, not large ones, just faint discolorations scattered along the edges. The farmer rubs one leaf between his fingers. It feels softer than it should, slightly damp, almost fragile. He does not look frightened. Not yet. Crops sometimes develop spots or minor illnesses. It happens often enough that most farmers simply watch and wait. Still, the sight lingers in your mind as you continue down the path. Later that afternoon, you pass another field where two men are discussing the same strange marks on their plants. Their voices are low and thoughtful. One of them shrugs, suggesting that perhaps too much rain has damaged the leaves. The other wonders if insects might be responsible. Neither explanation seems especially convincing, but there is no sense of urgency yet. Across the countryside, farmers occasionally encounter small problems in their crops. A patch here grows poorly, a row there suffers from mould or rot. Usually the damage remains limited to a small section of the field. Life continues. As the day moves toward evening, you return toward the cottages clustered near the road. The smell of cooking fires begins drifting through the air. Somewhere a pot lid rattles as boiling water bubbles beneath it. Children run past you carrying armfuls of firewood, their laughter echoing briefly between the stone walls. Inside one cottage, a family is already preparing supper. A pot of potatoes simmers slowly over the hearth. The skins have begun to split open as the heat softens them. The simple smell of warm potatoes fills the room. It is comforting. This quiet meal is repeated across thousands of cottages every evening. Yet scattered across the countryside, small worries are beginning to gather. One widely accepted historical detail is that the potato disease that would later devastate Ireland first appeared in Europe in the mid-1840s. Farmers in several regions began noticing strange blackening on their potato leaves before the full disaster became visible. At the time, however, very few people understood what they were seeing. Agricultural science was still developing, and the idea that microscopic organisms could destroy entire crops was not yet widely recognized. Instead, people searched for explanations that made sense within their everyday experience. That evening, as neighbours gather outside their cottages, the conversation occasionally turns toward the unusual spots appearing in some fields. One man suggests the plants may have been damaged by unusually humid weather. Another wonders if a strange fog had passed through the valley the night before. Yes. Someone else quietly mentions that a similar problem was rumoured to have appeared in another county. The group falls silent for a moment. Rumours travel quickly in rural communities. Still, nobody is ready to believe that the problem might spread widely. You sit near the doorway of a cottage as the evening grows darker. The fire inside crackles softly, casting warm light across the stone walls. A woman peels boiled potatoes with practiced hands, passing them to her children. Outside, the sky deepens into shades of blue and grey. The first stars appear faintly above the hills. For now, the routine of daily life remains intact. Yet in scattered patches across the countryside, farmers continue noticing strange changes in their crops. A plant that looked healthy yesterday appears wilted today. A cluster of leaves darkens more quickly than expected. When pulled from the soil, a few potatoes show signs of soft rot spreading beneath their skins. These early symptoms are subtle enough that many farmers dismiss them. One curious detail recorded in some accounts from the period is that certain fields seemed perfectly healthy, while others nearby showed signs of disease. This uneven pattern made the situation even more confusing for those trying to understand what was happening. A farmer might walk through one field full of strong green plants, then cross a stone wall into another where the leaves had begun to darken and curl. Such inconsistency makes the problem easy to underestimate. Later that week, you pass by the same farmer you met earlier in the morning. He is again examining his plants carefully. This time he pulls one from the soil. The potato beneath the surface looks healthy at first glance, but when he cuts it open with his knife, a faint brown discoloration spreads through the flesh. He frowns quietly. It is not the sort of thing that causes panic. Crops sometimes produce damaged potatoes. Yet the pattern is beginning to repeat itself across more fields. People are starting to notice. Experts today know that the disease responsible is a plant pathogen known as Phytophthora infestans. But of course, no one here knows that name or understands its nature. Instead, explanations remain uncertain. Some people blame unusual weather patterns. Others whisper about mysterious atmospheric conditions that might be affecting the crops. Historians continue to debate whether farmers in the earliest weeks of the blight fully grasped how serious the problem might become. Some records suggest that many believed the damage would remain limited and that the following year's harvest would recover normally. After all, crops have always faced occasional trouble. Why should this year be any different? As night settles over the countryside, the fields grow quiet again. The potato plants rustle softly in the breeze. From a distance, they still appear green and healthy beneath the moonlight. Yet hidden among their leaves, the first signs of something far more dangerous are slowly spreading. And tomorrow morning, when the farmers walk through their fields again, they may notice that those small dark spots have begun to grow. Morning arrives again with a pale grey sky and the familiar dampness of Irish air pressing softly against the land. You wake to the low crackle of the hearth and the quiet shifting of people moving around the cottage. Outside, the world smells of wet grass and peat smoke, and for a few peaceful minutes, everything feels almost unchanged. But something has shifted. When you step outside and walk toward the fields, the difference reveals itself slowly, at first, then all at once. You notice the smell before anything else. It is faint but unpleasant. A sour, slightly sweet scent drifting through the air. Farmers will later describe it as the smell of rot carried by the wind. Ahead of you, several neighbours stand silently along the edge of a potato field. Their posture tells you immediately that something is wrong. You approach and follow their gaze. The green plants that looked healthy only days earlier now appear darker. Leaves sag heavily toward the soil. Patches of blackened stems spread through the rows like spilled ink. One farmer steps forward and lifts a plant carefully from the earth. The leaves crumble slightly in his hands, their once strong texture now soft and lifeless. He digs deeper with his spade and pulls up several potatoes. At first they seem normal, pale skins, rough shapes. But when he wipes the soil away and slices one open with a small knife, the inside reveals a brown spreading stain. Rot. Not just one potato either. Several of them show the same discoloration. You hear someone exhale slowly behind you. The realization moves quietly through the group standing there. Whatever strange illness touched the plants earlier has grown far worse. Across Ireland in the autumn of 1845, farmers began witnessing scenes very much like this one. What started as scattered spots on leaves suddenly transformed into rapid destruction across entire fields. The disease moved quickly in the damp Irish climate. Within days, fields that once appeared healthy could collapse into blackened decay. You walk carefully between the rows. The leaves brush against your hands as you pass, and they feel wet and fragile. Some crumble entirely when touched. The smell of rot grows stronger the farther you go. It is not the smell of ordinary harvest spoilage. This is sharper, more invasive, as if the plants themselves are dissolving. A man kneels beside a row and pulls another plant from the soil. The potatoes beneath it are already softening, their skins wrinkled and dark. He does not speak for several seconds. Then quietly, he says something every farmer here fears. The crop is gone. That realization spreads quickly across the countryside during these early weeks of the blight. Families who expected a full harvest suddenly face fields that cannot provide the food they depend on. One well-documented reality of this period is that roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Ireland's potato crop failed during the first year of the blight in 1845. While not yet the worst stage of the famine, it was enough to alarm communities that relied heavily on the harvest. You begin to see the signs of worry everywhere. Farmers walk through their fields repeatedly, hoping to find areas that remain healthy. Some plants still appear green and untouched, others are collapsing into dark patches of rot. The uneven pattern creates confusion. A man in the next field insists his crop still looks strong. Another farmer, only a short distance away, reports losing nearly everything. People try to understand what might be causing this strange destruction. One curious idea circulating in certain parts of Ireland claims that the disease is caused by unusual atmospheric conditions, perhaps a strange fog or poisonous air drifting across Europe. At the time, this theory sounds almost reasonable to many observers, since the damage often appears suddenly after damp weather. Others suspect that the soil itself has somehow turned unhealthy. A few farmers even blame lightning storms from earlier in the season. Of course, none of these explanations solve the problem. You watch as neighbours begin gathering whatever potatoes they can salvage from the ground. The harvest is rushed now. People dig quickly, hoping to save the remaining tubers before the rot spreads further. Sacks fill slowly. Many of the potatoes appear fine at first glance. Yet when cut open later, some reveal the same creeping brown stains inside. The uncertainty is almost worse than the damage itself. Can the good potatoes be stored safely? Will the rot continue spreading after harvest? No one seems sure. You carry a small basket back toward the cottages, where several families are sorting through the damaged crop. Women sit near the doorways, cutting potatoes open one by one, separating the healthy from the spoiled. A growing pile of blackened potatoes lies nearby, destined to be thrown away or fed to animals. Children watch quietly, sensing the tension in the air. Up until now, the potato harvest has always brought relief and satisfaction. The season of digging usually means full storage pits, and the comforting knowledge that winter meals are secure. This year feels different. A few older farmers speak quietly about past crop troubles, remembering smaller failures that occurred decades earlier. Those events were difficult, but communities eventually recovered. Many people hope this will be similar. Researchers today continue discussing how quickly farmers bears recognise the true scale of the disaster. Some evidence suggests that many initially believed the following year's crop would return to normal, treating the blight as a terrible but temporary setback. Standing here beside the damaged harvest, it is easy to understand why. Even now, some potatoes still appear healthy. The fields are not entirely destroyed. Hope, however fragile, remains. As evening approaches, carts creak slowly along the lanes, carrying whatever potatoes have been gathered. Farmers store them carefully in pits lined with straw and soil, hoping the rot will not spread further. The air grows cooler as the sun sinks behind the hills. Smoke rises once again from cottage chimneys as families prepare supper. Inside the cottages, the evening meal looks familiar. Boiled potatoes sit steaming in wooden bowls. Yet tonight, each potato is examined a little more carefully before it is eaten. You sit quietly beside the hearth, listening to the soft bubbling of the pot and the crackling of the peat fire. Outside, the wind moves gently through the fields. Where green plants once stood, tall, dark patches now stretch across the soil. And somewhere beneath the fading light, the disease continues its silent work. The morning after the ruined harvest feels strangely quiet. You wake to the same soft grey light slipping through the thatch above your head, but the sounds outside carry a different weight now. No cheerful chatter drifts along the lane. No children are racing through the fields just yet. Instead, the air feels slow and thoughtful, as if the entire village is pausing to consider what comes next. You push open the cottage door and step back into the cool, damp morning. The fields lie silent beyond the stone walls. A few farmers are already outside, but their movements are slower than usual. Some walk through their potato rows again, perhaps hoping that yesterday's discovery was an exaggeration. It was not. You return inside the cottage, and for the first time you notice the space around you more carefully. This single room is the centre of everything in daily life here. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth smoothed by years of footsteps. Near the centre of the room sits the hearth, its peat fire glowing softly even after the night. Above it hangs a blackened iron pot suspended from a simple hook. The smell of smoke fills the air, mixed with the earthy scent of damp clothing drying near the fire. In rural Ireland during the early 19th century, it was extremely common for poor tenant families to live in one-room cottages like this. These homes were often built by the families themselves using stone mud and thatch gathered from nearby land. They were small but surprisingly sturdy when maintained well. You glance toward the sleeping area along the wall. Several straw mattresses lie close together covered with rough wool blankets. Families often sleep side by side here, sharing warmth during cold nights. Privacy is not really part of life in such close quarters. Near the door stands a simple wooden table, worn smooth from years of use. A few stools sit nearby, though many meals are eaten standing or sitting close to the hearth. Storage is minimal. A small chest holds clothing and a few important belongings. Along the wall hang baskets, tools and bundles of dried herbs collected during warmer months. A pig wanders slowly across the floor, snuffling curiously near the hearth before curling up in a corner. This detail might surprise modern visitors, but many rural cottages of this time shared space with animals. Livestock brought inside the house during colder weather could help warm the room while also protecting valuable animals from theft or predators. You move closer to the hearth where a woman is preparing breakfast. She lifts the lid of the iron pot, releasing a cloud of steam that carries the familiar smell of boiled potatoes. Even after yesterday's worrying discoveries, potatoes remain the centre of the meal. She removes several from the water and places them in a wooden bowl. Before anyone eats, however, each potato is sliced open with a small knife. The inside must be checked carefully now. Most appear healthy. A few show faint discoloration and are quietly set aside. Breakfast begins. The potatoes are eaten hot, their skins peeling easily under your fingers. Someone pours a small amount of milk into a shared cup, passing it around the table. No one speaks much during the meal. The worries from the fields have followed everyone inside. You listen to the soft sounds of eating and the crackling fire while the morning slowly unfolds outside. Although cottages like this appear simple, they are carefully arranged for survival. Every item has a purpose. The hearth provides heat and cooking. The thatched roof sheds rain while allowing smoke to escape slowly through its fibres. One curious observation noted by travellers during this period is how skillfully many Irish families constructed these homes with limited resources. Even without formal architectural training, generations of rural builders developed techniques that kept cottages standing through harsh winters and heavy rains. Of course, comfort is relative. When rain falls heavily, water sometimes seeps through the roof. Wind can slip through gaps in the stone walls, and during cold winters, the single fire must work hard to warm the entire room. Yet for many families, this cottage represents stability. Outside the world may feel uncertain, but inside these walls, life continues. After breakfast, the family begins their daily tasks. One person carries a bucket toward the nearby well. Another gathers peat fuel stacked beside the house. You step outside again, noticing how smoke curls gently from the chimneys of neighbouring cottages. Despite the troubling harvest, daily work continues. Animals still need feeding. Water must still be carried. Fences require repair. Life rarely pauses completely. Along the path, you meet an older man carrying a sack of potatoes over his shoulder. He nods politely but looks tired. When he sets the sack down, you see that the potatoes inside are carefully sorted. Some appear healthy, others are being cut open and discarded. He explains quietly that he and his son spent the night digging what remained of their field before the rot could spread further. They managed to save some of the crop, but not nearly enough. Across Ireland, thousands of families are making similar discoveries during this season. Fields that once promised security are producing far smaller harvests than expected. Many people hope the damage will remain limited to this year alone, but uncertainty lingers. Experts today continue discussing how fully communities understood the danger during these early months. Some evidence suggests that many farmers believed the next planting season would restore normal harvests. After all, the potato had rarely failed so dramatically before. Inside the cottages, families begin preparing their storage pits for winter. Potatoes that appear healthy are buried beneath layers of straw and soil to keep them cool and protected. Each potato stored now carries enormous value. The success of these storage pits may determine how long food lasts through the colder months ahead. You watch as neighbours move back and forth along the narrow lane carrying baskets and tools. Their conversations are quieter than usual. Yet life goes on. Children return to their games. Chickens wander through the grass searching for scraps. Smoke continues drifting lazily above the rooftops. Inside the cottage, the hearth fire burns steadily. It warms the room. It cooks the meals. It gathers the family together at the end of each day. For now, these small routines remain the steady centre of life. But outside the village, across countless fields where potatoes once grew thick and green, the silent damage left behind by the blight is only beginning to reveal its true consequences. The rhythm of the village does not stop simply because the harvest has failed. Morning light slips across the fields, again pale and cool, touching the stone walls and narrow lanes that wind between cottages. You wake to the same sounds as before. A rooster calls from somewhere behind the hedges. A cow shifts heavily in a nearby shed. The quiet murmur of voices drifts through the thin cottage walls as neighbours begin their day. Routine, it turns out, is one of the most powerful forces in human life. Even when uncertainty hangs over the countryside, there are still chores waiting to be done. You step outside into the crisp air and stretch your arms. The ground is damp with dew. The smell of peat smoke rises gently from the chimneys around you, mixing with the scent of wet grass and distant sea wind. Already people are moving along the path. A woman passes carrying 2 wooden buckets suspended from a yoke across her shoulders. Water must be fetched from the well every morning. The task is heavy, but it is simply part of life here. You decide to follow the path toward the fields. Work never truly ends for farming families in rural Ireland during the 1840s. Even when the potato crop has suffered damage, there are still animals to care for and land to maintain. A man nearby is repairing a section of stone wall that collapsed during a recent storm. He carefully lifts each rock into place, stacking them without mortar, the same way his father and grandfather once did. This style of dry stone wall construction has been used across Ireland for centuries. The stones fit together like a puzzle, forming strong barriers that can stand for decades if properly maintained. You pause to watch him work. Each stone is placed thoughtfully, as though the wall itself is a slow conversation between hands and earth. A little farther down the path, two young boys are cutting peat from a nearby bog. Their small spades slice into the dark soil, lifting thick blocks that will later be stacked and dried for fuel. Peat cutting is hard work, but it provides the fuel that warms cottages through cold months. Without it, many homes would struggle to keep their hearth fires burning. You step carefully across the boggy ground and pick up one of the peat blocks. It feels dense and slightly spongy, rich with the smell of ancient plants slowly compressed over centuries. Some observers visiting Ireland during this period noted the remarkable patience involved in peat harvesting. The fuel forms slowly in wet bogs over long periods of time, yet rural communities developed careful methods of cutting and drying it so that the resource could be used year after year. Nearby, the boys stack the blocks in neat rows where they will dry in the sun. Beyond the bog, another group of villagers is tending to livestock. A thin cow grazes along the edge of a field, while a farmer checks the wooden gate that keeps her contained. Animals remain valuable sources of milk, wool, and sometimes meat. Even families who depend heavily on potatoes usually keep a few animals when possible. You notice a woman milking a cow beside her cottage. The steady rhythm of milk striking the metal pail creates a soft tapping sound that blends with the morning breeze. Daily life here is made up of dozens of these small tasks: carrying water, repairing fences, cutting peat, feeding animals. None of them seem dramatic, yet together they fill nearly every waking hour. You wander back toward the village path where a few children are gathering sticks for the hearth fire. One girl proudly carries a bundle nearly as large as herself. Even the youngest members of the household contribute to the work. At midday, the smell of cooking begins to drift through the air again. You step inside a nearby cottage where lunch is being prepared. The meal looks familiar. More potatoes simmer in a pot above the hearth. A few cabbage leaves lie on the table waiting to be chopped and added to the pot. Meals may be simple, but they provide the energy needed to continue working. One interesting observation recorded in several traveller accounts is how structured the day often feels in these rural communities. Despite the lack of clocks in many cottages, people organise their routines around sunlight meals and the steady cycle of agricultural work. Morning tasks fill the hours before breakfast. Field work continues until midday. Afternoon chores follow until the sun begins to lower behind the hills, and then slowly the evening returns. While you sit near the fire, waiting for lunch, conversation turns quietly toward the damaged harvest once again. One man suggests that perhaps next year, farmers should plant additional oats or barley to avoid relying entirely on potatoes. Another shakes his head gently. Those crops require larger fields and better soil than most tenants possess. Potatoes have always been the most reliable choice for small plots of land. For generations, they have provided enough food to keep families alive. Yet now doubt is beginning to grow. Researchers today continue to examine how deeply the potato shaped Irish rural society before the famine. Some historians suggest that the crop allowed population numbers to rise rapidly during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Others point out that this dependence also created a fragile system where failure of the potato harvest could place millions of people at risk. Sitting beside the hearth, listening to quiet conversation and the gentle bubbling of the cooking pot, it is easy to sense how both ideas might be true. The potato made life possible here, but it also became the single pillar holding everything upright. After lunch, the work continues. You help carry a bundle of peat back toward the cottages. The weight presses against your arms as you walk, reminding you how physical daily life here can be. The afternoon sun breaks briefly through the clouds, casting soft light across the fields. In the distance, farmers continue examining their damaged crops, still hoping to salvage what remains. The routine of work moves forward like a slow river. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of chores and meals, a quiet question now lingers in every household. If the potato cannot be trusted, what happens next? The answer has not yet arrived. But somewhere beyond the green hills surrounding the village, the next stage of the story is already beginning to unfold. The quiet routines of the village continue, but something subtle has changed in the way people move through the day. You notice it as you walk along the narrow lane that connects the cottages. Conversations linger a little longer. Neighbours pause more often at gates or stone walls, exchanging small pieces of news about fields and harvests. In difficult times, people naturally gather closer together. You see it in the way a woman carries a basket of potatoes down the road and stops halfway to offer a few to an older neighbour whose crop failed completely. The exchange is casual, almost wordless. A small nod, a quiet thank you. No one draws attention to it. Acts of sharing like this are woven deeply into rural life. Community has always been essential here. Families may live in separate cottages, but their lives overlap constantly through work kinship and daily cooperation. You pass a cluster of cottages where several men are helping repair a damaged roof. A ladder leans against the wall while bundles of fresh thatch lie nearby. One man climbs carefully upward, securing the straw, while another passes him tools. No one is being paid for this work. They simply help because that is what neighbours do. This cooperative spirit appears often in descriptions of Irish rural communities during the early 19th century. Many villages practiced informal systems of mutual assistance, where families supported one another during planting, harvesting, and building projects. These shared labour traditions were sometimes called maithial, a form of collective work where neighbours gathered to complete large tasks together. You watch the group on the roof laughing softly as someone nearly drops a bundle of straw. The mood is relaxed despite the worry hanging over the harvest. Humour, it seems, survives even in uncertain times. Further down the path, a small gathering has formed beside a cottage door. A woman stirs a pot of thin soup while several children sit nearby with wooden bowls in their laps. The soup is simple: water, cabbage, and a few sliced potatoes. Yet the pot is large enough that several neighbouring families will share the meal. The smell drifting from the pot is surprisingly comforting. You sit nearby on a low stone wall, listening as the adults talk quietly about their crops. Each person reports a slightly different experience. One farmer lost half his field. Another claims most of his potatoes remained healthy. A third shakes his head and says the rot spread faster than he could harvest. The mixed reports make it difficult for anyone to understand what the future holds. Across Ireland, in 1845, this uneven pattern of crop failure created widespread confusion. Some areas experienced severe losses, while others saw smaller damage during the first season of the blight. Because of this, many communities initially believed the problem might remain local or temporary. You notice a boy nearby carefully cutting potatoes into smaller pieces before placing them in the soup pot. This method helps stretch the meal so more people can eat. Small adjustments like this begin appearing everywhere. Meals become slightly thinner, portions grow a little smaller, yet people remain determined to support one another. An elderly man sitting beside you begins telling a story about a difficult winter from many years earlier. His voice moves slowly rising and falling with the rhythm of memory. He describes how neighbours once gathered during a snowstorm to share food and fuel when several families nearly ran out of supplies. Stories like this serve an important purpose. They remind listeners that hardship has been faced before. You listen as the group around the soup pot nods thoughtfully. No one interrupts the old man. his memory carries a quiet authority earned through long experience. One small but interesting cultural detail from this period is the importance of storytelling within rural Irish communities. Evenings were often filled with tale songs and local folklore shared around the hearth. These stories pass down family history humour and lessons from earlier generations. As the afternoon fades toward evening, the villagers begin returning to their cottages. You walk with a family carrying a basket of firewood. Their youngest child skips ahead along the path while the parents follow more slowly. Despite the strain placed on the community, daily life still contains moments of warmth. A dog runs happily along the roadside. Someone whistles softly while carrying a bundle of peat. The air smells faintly of rain approaching from the west. Inside the cottages, supper preparations begin again. Tonight, the meals look similar to yesterday. Boiled potatoes, a little cabbage, perhaps some milk, if the household still has a cow producing well. But each potato is examined with care before it reaches the table. You sit beside the hearth as neighbours gather inside to escape the growing evening chill. The room fills with quiet conversation, the orange glow of the fire flickering across the stone walls. The talk turns again to the strange disease affecting the crops. Some believe the worst may already be over. Others worry that next year's planting might suffer the same fate. Modern researchers continue to explore how people interpreted the first year of the blight as it unfolded. Many rural families lacking scientific knowledge about plant disease struggled to predict whether the problem would continue spreading in future seasons. From where you sit watching the firelight dance across the room, it is easy to understand why uncertainty remains so strong. So much depends on the next harvest. Outside night settles quietly over the village. Wind moves gently across the fields where the damaged potato plants now stand dark against the fading light. Inside the cottages, families finish their meals and prepare for sleep. Neighbours who shared food earlier in the day return to their own homes, carrying with them the quiet comfort that comes from knowing they are not facing the coming winter alone. For now, that sense of community remains one of the strongest defences against the uncertainty growing across the countryside. But beyond these small clusters of cottages, the blight continues spreading silently through fields across Ireland, and before long, the strength of these communities will face a far greater test than anyone here yet imagines. The calm strength of the village begins to feel slightly more fragile as the days pass. You notice it first in the way conversations change when certain topics arise. People still greet one another warmly along the narrow lanes, but when the talk turns toward rent, voices grow quieter. Rent day is never far from anyone's mind. You walk along the path that leads toward a slightly larger house, standing on a low rise outside the village. It is not a grand mansion by the standards of great estates, but compared with the small cottages scattered across the hills, it appears impressive. This house belongs to the local landlord's agent. In 19th century Ireland, most rural families do not own the land they farm. Instead, they rent small plots from landlords who often live far away, sometimes even in England. The daily management of these estates is usually handled by agents or middlemen responsible for collecting rent from tenant farmers. You pass a farmer leaning against a stone wall, staring toward the agent's house with a thoughtful expression. When he notices you, he nods slowly. Rent will soon be due. Even in good years, this obligation can be stressful. Families must carefully manage their harvest to ensure enough crops remain to sell or trade in order to meet the payment. This year, the situation feels different. With so many potatoes lost to disease, the question lingers quietly in everyone's mind. How will people pay? You continue along the road where several tenants have gathered outside a small barn to discuss the problem. Their voices are calm but serious. One man suggests selling a pig to cover part of his rent. Another mentions that he may need to travel to town to find temporary labour. These choices are never easy. Livestock represent both food and income. Selling an animal may solve one problem while creating another. You sit nearby and listen. A younger farmer explains that he plans to harvest what remains of his crop and sell some potatoes in the market before prices fall further. Another shakes his head and warns that too many farmers are likely thinking the same thing. Markets can quickly become crowded when everyone tries to sell at once. The uncertainty surrounding rent payments has shaped rural Irish life for generations. Tenant farming systems developed over centuries, often dividing land into smaller and smaller plots as families grew. Some historians point out that by the 1840s, many Irish tenants were farming extremely small holdings that left little room for financial security. Even minor crop failures could create serious difficulties. You notice a cart approaching along the road. It carries two men dressed slightly more formally than the farmers around you. One of them holds a small leather notebook. The conversation around the barn stops almost immediately. The landlord's agent has arrived to speak with tenants. He climbs down from the cart and begins greeting the farmers with polite but reserved nods. His tone is professional, calm, businesslike. He asks several men about their harvest. They answer carefully. No one wants to sound desperate, but no one can pretend the crop has been normal either. You watch the exchange quietly. The agent writes notes in his book as each tenant speaks. Occasionally he asks a follow-up question about acreage or expected yield. The atmosphere remains tense but respectful. Landlord agents during this period often held considerable power over tenant families. They were responsible for collecting rent and reporting on the condition of the estate. In some cases, they could also recommend eviction if tenants fell behind on payments. For now, however, the conversation remains civil. The agent eventually assures the group that the estate owner is aware of the poor harvest and will consider the situation carefully before making any decisions. It is not a promise, but it offers a small measure of reassurance. As the cart rolls away down the road, the farmers remain standing quietly for several moments. One man finally exhales and rubs the back of his neck. Another mutters that winter will be difficult enough without worrying about rent. You walk back toward the cottages where women are hanging freshly washed clothes along simple lines stretched between wooden posts. The fabric moves gently in the breeze. Life continues with its familiar patterns. Children chase one another through the grass. A dog naps lazily near a doorway. Smoke drifts upward from hearth fires preparing the evening meal. Yet beneath these ordinary scenes, the financial pressure facing tenant families remains very real. An unusual detail, occasionally mentioned in historical records from this era, involves how some landlords responded differently to the early years of the famine. A few estates temporarily reduced rents or offered assistance, while others continued demanding full payment despite the worsening crop failures. The variety of responses created very different experiences for tenants, depending on where they lived. Inside a cottage nearby, you sit beside the hearth while a family discusses their plans quietly. They count the remaining potatoes stored in their pit. They estimate how long the supply might last. Then they begin calculating how much of the harvest could be sold without risking their own food supply. These are difficult calculations. Every potato sold brings needed money. Every potato kept means another meal during winter. As the fire crackles softly in the hearth, the family studies the small pile of potatoes on the table like precious stones. The decisions made in rooms like this one are happening across thousands of cottages throughout Ireland. Outside, the evening wind moves gently through the darkening fields. Somewhere beyond the hills, carts roll slowly toward market towns, carrying sacks of potatoes that farmers hope will still bring enough money to cover their rent. For now, the system of land and payment continues functioning, but the balance holding everything together has grown far more delicate than it was only a few weeks earlier. And in the months ahead, that delicate balance will be tested again and again. The next morning arrives under a low ceiling of grey clouds. The air feels heavier than usual, thick with moisture drifting in from the Atlantic. When you step outside the cottage, the ground squishes slightly beneath your boots, reminding you how often Ireland lives under damp skies. Farmers have already returned to their fields, but today their movements carry a different purpose. They are not planting or harvesting. Instead, they are searching for answers. You walk along a narrow path toward a group gathered beside a patch of damaged potato plants. Several men kneel in the soil, examining leaves carefully as though the plants might reveal some hidden clue. One farmer lifts a leaf and turns it toward the light. Dark stains spread across the surface like spilled ink. He rubs the leaf between his fingers, then sniffs it cautiously. The faint smell of decay lingers there, unpleasant and unfamiliar. No one speaks for a moment. Eventually, someone mutters that the disease must be spreading through the soil. Another suggests that too much rain this summer weakened the plants. A third man insists the problem began with a strange fog that passed through the valley several weeks earlier. The conversation moves in circles because nobody truly understands what they are facing. Today we know that the potato blight was caused by a microscopic organism that thrives in cool, damp conditions. It spreads through invisible spores carried by wind and moisture, infecting potato leaves and eventually destroying the tubers beneath the soil. But during the 1840s, the science of plant disease remained poorly understood. Germ theory itself had not yet been widely accepted. Farmers were forced to interpret the destruction using whatever explanations seemed plausible. You kneel beside the group and examine the plants yourself. Some leaves remain green and healthy. Others appear burned along the edges, their dark patches spreading outward in irregular shapes. A few stems have collapsed entirely, leaving the plant drooping toward the ground. A farmer nearby digs carefully into the soil and lifts several potatoes. One looks normal. Another reveals a brown streak running through the centre when cut open. The pattern is maddeningly inconsistent. Across Europe during these early years of the blight, scientists and agricultural experts struggled to identify the cause. Some believe the disease resulted from unusual weather patterns affecting plant growth. Others suspected that electricity in the atmosphere might somehow be damaging crops. One widely circulated idea blamed volcanic activity in distant parts of the world for releasing harmful gases that drifted across the continent. Listening to the farmers around you debate their theories, you realise how easy it is for uncertainty to produce strange explanations. When people cannot see the true cause of a disaster, imagination often fills the gap. Later that afternoon, word arrives that a travelling agricultural advisor has come to a nearby town. Several farmers decide to visit him in hopes that someone with scientific knowledge might understand what is happening. You join the group walking along the muddy road toward the market town. The journey takes over an hour. Along the way, you pass more fields where potato plants show the same troubling symptoms. By the time you reach the town square, a small crowd has already gathered around the visitor. He stands beside a wooden table displaying several diseased potato plants. His clothing suggests he is an educated man, perhaps connected to one of the agricultural societies that have begun studying farming methods across Britain and Ireland. He speaks calmly while examining the damaged leaves. According to his explanation, the disease might be caused by a fungus spreading through the plants. He recommends removing infected plants quickly and improving drainage in the fields. The farmers listen carefully, but the advice offers little comfort. Removing infected plants may slow the spread in small gardens. In large fields where the disease has already appeared, the suggestion feels almost impossible. You watch as one farmer lifts a rotting potato from the table. He asks the advisor whether next year's crop will suffer the same fate. The man hesitates before answering. He cannot be certain. That single uncertainty hangs heavily over the entire crowd. Researchers today continue exploring how agricultural experts in the 1840s attempted to understand the blight as it spread across Europe. Early theories ranged widely because scientists lacked the tools to observe plant pathogens clearly. Some specialists did suspect fungal infection, but proving it would take years of further study. You leave the town square with the group of farmers as evening approaches. The walk back toward the village feels quieter than the journey earlier that day. Everyone carries the same troubling realization. Even the experts do not fully understand the disease. When you return to the cottages, the smell of supper cooking once again drifts through the air. Inside one home, a family sits near the hearth while slicing potatoes carefully before adding them to the pot. Each potato is inspected with growing caution. Some show faint signs of rot and are discarded. Others appear safe to eat. This constant inspection has already become part of daily life. You sit beside the fire and listen to the conversation unfolding around the room. People discuss the strange advice offered by the visiting agricultural expert. Some believe removing infected plants might help next season. Others argue the disease is already too widespread. Outside the cottage, rain begins falling softly across the fields. The gentle tapping against the roof creates a steady rhythm that fills the quiet night. Yet for the farmers lying awake in their beds, that sound brings little comfort. Because damp weather is exactly what the blight seems to love most. And as the rain continues falling across Ireland's fields, the mysterious disease is quietly gaining strength. The rain continues through the night and into the following morning, tapping gently against the thatched roofs of the cottages. You wake to the steady rhythm of droplets sliding down the small window and dripping onto the soft earth outside. The sky is a pale silver, the kind that promises a long, damp day. Inside the cottage, the fire is already burning. Someone has risen early to coax the peat embers back to life. A kettle sits near the flames, its lid rattling softly as the water warms. The smell of smoke and wet wool fills the room. You stretch and sit up slowly, pulling a blanket around your shoulders while the sounds of the household begin to stir. Outside the village is waking as well. The rain has not stopped anyone from moving through their routines. Farmers walk along the muddy lanes with their coats pulled tightly around them. A woman hurries past the door carrying a covered basket. Two children splash carefully through shallow puddles while collecting sticks for the hearth. But today there is another destination drawing people toward the centre of the village. A large iron pot has been set up near the crossroads. You follow the path and soon see the small gathering forming around it. Smoke curls upward from the fire beneath the pot, carrying the faint scent of vegetables and broth. Someone has begun preparing soup. In times of difficulty, communities often create shared meals to help stretch limited food supplies. The pot you see bubbling over the fire contains cabbage onions and thin slices of potato. The soup is simple, but it will feed many people. You watch as villagers approach the pot carrying bowls, mugs, or small wooden containers. Each person receives a ladle of the steaming broth before stepping aside to make room for the next. The scene feels both humble and quietly powerful. A teacher from the nearby parish school stands beside the fire, stirring the pot carefully. He explains that several families contributed ingredients that morning so everyone in the village could share a warm meal. Across Ireland, during the early stages of the famine, communities sometimes organised similar forms of informal relief. Local parishes, charitable groups and neighbours occasionally pooled resources to create shared meals for those who had lost the most food. These early efforts were small, but they offered a brief sense of solidarity during uncertain days. You accept a bowl and sit on a nearby stone wall. The soup tastes mild and slightly earthy. The potatoes inside are soft, nearly dissolving into the broth. Around you, people eat quietly while the rain continues falling across the fields. A man nearby jokes gently that the soup might be the finest meal he has had all week. The comment draws soft laughter from several listeners. Even now, humour slips into daily conversation like a familiar companion. One interesting observation noted in several accounts from this time is how quickly rural communities adapted their cooking methods when food supplies grew uncertain. Stretching ingredients through soups and stews allowed households to feed more people using smaller quantities of vegetables. You notice a woman adding a handful of oats to the pot as the soup continues simmering. Every small addition helps. After finishing your bowl, you wander toward the edge of the village where several men are discussing news brought from a nearby town. They speak about rumours that government officials in Dublin are beginning to study the spreading crop disease. Some believe assistance may arrive in the coming months. Others remain sceptical. Ireland at this time is governed as part of the United Kingdom, meaning that decisions about large-scale relief often come from administrators far removed from rural villages like this one. Government leaders in London and Dublin had begun receiving reports about the potato blight spreading across the countryside. Agricultural inspectors and local officials are collecting information about the damaged harvests. Yet the full scale of the disaster is not yet fully understood. You listen as the group debates what these reports might mean. One man insists that government aid will surely arrive if the harvest remains poor next year. Another shrugs and says politicians often move slowly when problems occur far from their own homes. Their conversation drifts between hope and doubt. Researchers continue examining how early government responses to the blight unfolded during 1845 and 1846. Some policymakers believed the crisis might remain temporary, while others warned that large portions of the population could soon face severe shortages if the disease continued spreading. For now, decisions remain distant and uncertain. The rain finally begins to lighten as afternoon approaches. Grey clouds thin slightly, allowing a faint glow of sunlight to spread across the wet fields. Water glistens along the stone walls and narrow paths leading between cottages. You return toward the crossroads, where the soup pot still bubbles gently over the fire. Several children now stand nearby, holding their bowls carefully while waiting for another serving. The teacher smiles as he ladles more broth into each container. Despite the worries hanging over the village, the shared meal has brought a brief sense of warmth. You sit quietly near the fire and watch the steam rising from the pot. Across the road, farmers continue moving through their fields, still checking the damaged potato plants. The disease remains there, silent and persistent. Yet for this small moment in the middle of a rainy day, the village has gathered together around a simple pot of soup, reminding everyone that even in difficult times, people rarely face hardship completely alone. The fire crackles softly. The soup continues simmering, and the long story of survival in famine-era Ireland slowly unfolds, one quiet day at a time. The rain clears during the night, leaving the countryside washed and shining under a pale morning sun. When you step outside the cottage, the air smells fresh and cool, with the faint sweetness of wet grass rising from the fields. Puddles still sit along the narrow lanes, reflecting pieces of sky between the stone walls. Today, many villagers are preparing to travel to the market town. You notice the movement almost immediately. Carts creak along the road, their wooden wheels pressing deep tracks into the soft earth. Farmers walk beside them, carrying sacks over their shoulders. Inside those sacks are potatoes, not the spoiled ones that were thrown away earlier in the season, but the small portion of the harvest that still appears healthy. You decide to follow the road toward town. The walk takes you past several fields where farmers are finishing the last of their digging. They move quickly now, hoping to gather whatever can still be saved before the disease spreads further underground. Along the way you meet a man guiding a thin horse, pulling a cart stacked with sacks. He explains that he plans to sell some of his remaining potatoes in the market before too many others arrive with the same idea. If everyone tries to sell at once, the price may fall. Markets in rural Ireland during the 1840s were essential meeting points for trade and information. Farmers brought crops, livestock, butter and eggs to sell, while merchants offered goods ranging from cloth and tools to tea and sugar. For many tenant families, the market provided one of the few opportunities to earn cash. After about an hour of walking, the road opens into the small market town. The square is already busy. Carts line the edges of the street, while farmers unload sacks of potatoes onto wooden tables. Horses stamp impatiently beside the stalls. Chickens cluck loudly from baskets carried by women weaving through the crowd. You notice the smell first. Fresh vegetables mix with the earthy scent of soil still clinging to potatoes pulled from the ground only yesterday. Smoke from nearby cooking fires drifts through the air as vendors prepare small meals for travellers. The market is alive with sound. Voices call out prices. Coins clink softly as hands exchange payment. Some people greet friends they have not seen in weeks. Others stand quietly, studying the goods displayed on the stalls. You walk past a long table where a farmer has spread out several piles of potatoes. He carefully arranges them so the healthiest looking ones sit on top. Customers approach lifting potatoes and examining them closely. Every buyer now knows the signs of rot. They look for dark patches on the skin. They check for softness when squeezed. The farmer watches nervously while each potato is inspected. Despite the damage caused by the blight, potatoes are still being sold throughout Ireland during these early months of the crisis. Many farmers attempt to sell whatever portion of the harvest appears safe before the disease spreads further. But the market holds a strange contradiction. Food still exists here, yet not everyone can afford to buy it. You notice a woman standing beside one stall holding a small coin purse in her hand. She studies the prices carefully, then slowly counts the coins inside. After a moment, she sighs and walks away without purchasing anything. Nearby, a butcher is selling cuts of meat hung from iron hooks beneath a wooden awning. The smell of roasted beef drifts from a small cooking fire beside the stall. But few people stop there. Meat has always been expensive for many rural families. Now it feels even more distant. You continue wandering through the crowded square. At another stall, a merchant is selling sacks of grain brought from larger farms farther inland. Barley and oats sit in neat piles beside a weighing scale. Several farmers stand nearby discussing whether they might plant more grain next year instead of relying so heavily on potatoes. The idea is appealing in theory, but grain requires larger fields and more labour. Many tenants simply do not possess enough land to make such a change practical. An unusual detail, recorded in some contemporary accounts, is how foreign visitors sometimes express surprise when seeing food exported from Irish ports during the famine years while local populations struggled. Ireland remained a major producer of agricultural goods such as grain and livestock, much of which continued being sold to markets in Britain. The complexity of that system created debates that historians still examine today when discussing the broader causes of the famine. You stop beside a stall where a merchant from another county is selling imported goods. Among the items on display are small packets of tea-rough cloth for clothing and a few pieces of soap. A group of children stands nearby, staring curiously at the soap. Soap remains a small luxury for many households. The merchant laughs softly and tells them they can smell it if they like. One child lifts the bar carefully and inhales its sharp, clean scent with wide eyes. Moments like this remind you how rare certain comforts remain in rural life. As the afternoon passes, the market grows louder. More carts arrive. More sacks of potatoes appear on the tables. Prices begin shifting as sellers compete for buyers. Some farmers manage to sell part of their crop. Others find fewer customers than they hoped. You notice the man with the horse cart from earlier standing beside his stall, counting coins carefully. He managed to sell several sacks, though the price was lower than he expected. Still, the money will help. Perhaps it will cover part of his rent. Perhaps it will buy additional food later in the winter. As the sun begins lowering behind the rooftops, the market slowly starts to empty. Farmers load their remaining goods back onto carts. Horses pull away along the muddy roads, leading back towards scattered villages across the countryside. You begin walking home as well. Behind you, the market square grows quieter again. Food remains on many of the tables, but the uneasy feeling follows you down the road, because the presence of food in the market does not always mean the people who need it most can obtain it. And as the blight continues spreading across Ireland's fields, that uncomfortable truth will become more visible with each passing season. The road back from the market feels longer than the journey earlier in the day. Your boots sink slightly into the damp earth with each step, and the sky above the hills has begun turning the pale colour that comes just before sunset. Farmers walk beside you in small groups, guiding carts or carrying sacks that are either lighter than expected or still heavy with unsold goods. Conversation drifts quietly along the road. Some people discuss the prices they managed to get in town. Others simply walk in silence, perhaps calculating how long their remaining food will last. The air holds the faint smell of soil and horse sweat, mixed with the lingering smoke from distant cottages preparing evening meals. You soon notice something else along the road that did not appear there only a few weeks earlier. People walking with no carts at all. A family approaches slowly from the opposite direction. The father carries a bundle tied in cloth across his back. A woman walks beside him, holding the hand of a young child whose steps look tired and uneven. Behind them follows another child dragging a stick along the roadside stones. They are not returning from market. They are travelling toward it. You step aside to let them pass, and hear the father explaining quietly to someone nearby that their potato crop failed almost completely. He hopes the town might offer work or perhaps charity from the parish. Scenes like this begin appearing across Ireland as the months pass after the first failed harvest. Families whose crops produce little food sometimes travel to nearby towns in search of employment or assistance. For many, the journey begins as a short trip, but sometimes the road stretches farther than they expect. You continue walking and soon encounter another small group moving slowly along the lane. An elderly woman leans on a wooden stick while two younger relatives support her arms. Their clothes are dusty from travel. They explain that they have been walking since morning, hoping to reach a larger town before nightfall. The countryside is beginning to fill with quiet movement. People leaving small villages. People searching for help. People hoping that somewhere along the road they might find opportunity. One widely recognised historical reality is that the Irish famine produced significant migration within the country even before large-scale overseas emigration began. Many families first travelled short distances to nearby towns or regions where they believed work or relief might exist. You pass a narrow stone bridge where several travellers have stopped to rest. Some sit on the low wall beside the stream, while others refill water bottles from the flowing water. A young boy splashes his hands in the stream and laughs briefly at the cold. Despite the difficult circumstances, small moments of ordinary life continue appearing along the road. You sit on the bridge for a moment as well, watching the slow current slide beneath the stones. The travellers talk quietly among themselves. One man says he heard that a nearby town has begun offering small wages for building road improvements. Another claims the parish church distributes bread to families who have lost their crops. Whether these reports are accurate is difficult to know. Rumours often move faster than reliable news. An unusual observation recorded in several diaries from this time describes how quickly roads and paths became busier during the famine years. people walking long distances in search of food, work, or relatives created a steady flow of travellers across the countryside. For communities used to quiet agricultural rhythms, the growing movement of strangers along the roads felt both unfamiliar and unsettling. As evening approaches, you continue walking toward the village. Smoke from the cottages becomes visible in the distance, curling upward into the fading sky. But even here, the roads carry more travellers than before. A cart passes loaded with bedding and tools, suggesting that its owners may be leaving their farm entirely. The horse pulling it moves slowly, as if aware that the journey ahead will not be short. You notice the expressions on the faces of the people riding in the cart. They look tired but also determined. Sometimes leaving home feels like the only option left. Researchers studying this period still examine how families decided when to leave their land during the famine. Some households attempted to remain on their farms as long as possible, hoping conditions might improve. Others chose to seek work or aid elsewhere before their food supplies were completely exhausted. Each decision carried risks. Staying might lead to hunger. Leaving meant facing uncertainty on unfamiliar roads. You arrive back at the village just as the first stars begin appearing above the hills. The cottages glow softly with firelight. The smell of supper cooking drifts through the evening air. Inside one home, a family sits near the hearth eating boiled potatoes, carefully selected from their remaining stores. The meal looks modest but comforting after the long walk. You sit beside the fire and listen to the quiet conversation around you. Someone mentions the travellers seen along the road earlier. Another wonders how many more will appear in the coming weeks. Outside, the wind moves gently through the dark fields. The potato plants stand silent beneath the night sky, their leaves still carrying the marks left by the blight. Inside the cottages, families finish their meals and prepare for sleep. But along the roads beyond the village, more footsteps continue moving through the darkness, carrying people toward uncertain destinations in search of help. The quiet journeys have begun, and before long, the roads of Ireland will carry more travellers than anyone here has ever seen before. The road into town feels different when you walk it again a few days later. The fields on either side are quiet, the rows of potato plants standing uneven and tired beneath a pale morning sky. A thin mist clings low to the ground, drifting slowly between the stone walls. You follow the same path as before, though. Today your destination is not the market. Instead, you are heading toward a large grey building that sits just beyond the edge of town. The workhouse. Even from a distance, the structure looks severe. Tall stone walls surround a series of rectangular buildings arranged around a central yard. The windows are narrow. The gates are heavy and iron. Several people stand outside the entrance waiting quietly. You approach slowly, noticing how the mood here differs from the lively market square you visited earlier. No vendors call out prices, no carts rattle across the stones. The air feels still and tense. A guard opens the gate briefly to allow a small group inside. When it closes again, the heavy metal clang echoes across the courtyard. The workhouse system had been introduced in Ireland during the late 1830s as part of a larger poor relief programme. Each district built a workhouse intended to house people who could no longer support themselves. In theory, these institutions offered food and shelter. In practice, they were often harsh places designed to discourage people from seeking help, unless absolutely necessary. You step closer to the gate where a woman waits with two small children. The younger one clutches her skirt tightly, while the older child stares silently at the tall walls. She explains that their food has nearly run out. The potatoes they stored during harvest began rotting sooner than expected. The parish priest suggested they might find assistance here. You glance again at the high stone walls. Entering the workhouse carries a heavy meaning. Families who cross that gate often surrender what little independence they still possess. Life inside follows strict rules. Residents must perform labour in exchange for food and shelter. Men, women and children are often separated into different dormitories. For many rural families, accustomed to living together in close-knit cottages, that separation alone can feel frightening. The gate opens again and another small group is admitted. You follow them through the entrance. Inside the courtyard, the atmosphere feels strangely quiet. The buildings surrounding you are plain and functional, constructed more for efficiency than comfort. A supervisor stands near a wooden desk where new arrivals must register their names. You notice a line forming as people step forward one by one. When it is their turn, each person states their name, age and place of origin. The information is written carefully into a large ledger. Records from these institutions would later become valuable historical documents, offering detailed glimpses into the lives of thousands of people affected by the famine. A bell rings somewhere deeper inside the complex. The sound echoes through the stone corridors. You follow the line of new arrivals toward a large hall where a meal is being distributed. Workers carry buckets filled with a thick porridge made from oatmeal and water. Each resident receives a portion in a metal bowl before moving aside to sit at long wooden tables. The meal looks plain, but for many people entering the workhouse, it represents their first reliable food in days. You sit nearby and watch the quiet scene unfold. People eat slowly, some glancing around the unfamiliar room with uncertain expressions. A young boy sitting beside you whispers to his sister that the porridge tastes better than he expected. Small comforts can feel surprisingly important in difficult circumstances. One unusual detail recorded in several accounts from Irish workhouses involves the strict routines governing daily life inside. Residents followed schedules that included fixed meal times, assigned labour, and designated sleeping hours. The structure was meant to create order, though many found it restrictive compared with the freedom of rural life. After finishing their meal, new arrivals are guided through a medical inspection where a doctor briefly checks for illness before assigning them to dormitories. You walk along the corridor and notice rows of simple beds arranged closely together. Blankets lie folded at the foot of each one. Despite the plain surroundings, the room feels warmer than many cottages during winter months. The thick stone walls trap heat effectively. Yet comfort is not the primary goal here. The system was intentionally designed to provide only basic necessities. Some policymakers of the time believed that if conditions inside workhouses became too comfortable, too many people might abandon their farms and seek relief there instead. That philosophy shaped many decisions about how these institutions operated. As you leave the dormitory area and return towards the courtyard, you see more families arriving at the gate. The line outside has grown longer. Word spreads quickly when food becomes scarce. Researchers continue discussing how significant the workhouse system became during the famine years. While these institutions were intended to provide relief, they often became overcrowded as more people sought assistance. For now, however, the building still appears orderly. A bell rings again in the distance. Residents begin moving toward their assigned tasks. Some head toward laundry rooms where clothing must be washed. Others are directed to kitchens or maintenance work around the complex. Life inside the workhouse moves according to its own strict rhythm. You step back outside the gate and look once more at the tall stone walls. Behind them, hundreds of people will now eat, sleep, and work together while waiting to see how the famine unfolds beyond the town. Along the road leading away from the building, more families continue approaching slowly. Some carry bundles, others carry hope, and for many of them, the workhouse gate may become the dividing line between the life they once knew and the uncertain future that now waits ahead. Morning light creeps slowly across the village again, brushing pale gold across the damp grass and stone walls. When you step outside the cottage, the air carries that familiar mixture of peat, smoke, wet earth, and the faint salty hint of wind drifting inland from the sea. But today your attention settles on something different. Children. They are everywhere, as they always are, though their games feel quieter than they once did. A group of boys is gathered near the edge of a field, tossing small stones at a fence post, turning the simple act into a competition. A girl nearby is carefully braiding a doll made from scraps of cloth and straw. Life continues for them even as the world around them shifts. You sit on a low wall and watch them play. In rural Ireland during the 1840s, children often began contributing to family work at an early age. Young boys might help with animals, carry water, or gather peat from the bogs. Girls frequently assisted with cooking, cleaning, and caring for younger siblings. Yet despite their responsibilities, children still found time for play. A boy runs past you, chasing a rolling hoop made from a bent metal ring. He pushes it forward with a stick, while laughing loudly as it wobbles down the path. Another child joins him, and soon the game becomes a race. Their laughter floats across the fields like a brief burst of sunlight. Inside the cottages, however, childhood carries a heavier side as well. You step into one home where a mother sits beside the hearth, preparing breakfast. Two small children sit on stools beside her, watching as she carefully cuts potatoes into slices before placing them into a pot of boiling water. Each potato is still inspected closely. The children have learned to recognise the signs of rot just as the adults have. One little girl points to a dark spot on a potato and quietly says that one should not be eaten. Her mother nods and sets it aside. The lesson is simple but serious. Food must not be wasted, yet spoiled potatoes can cause illness if consumed. Children growing up during these years learn quickly how important food has become. Across many Irish families during the famine era, children sometimes played small roles in gathering additional sources of food. They searched hedgerows for berries during late summer or collected edible plants growing wild along the edges of fields. These small contributions rarely solved the larger problem of hunger, but they added something to the household supply. You walk back outside, where several children have gathered around a shallow stream flowing beneath a stone bridge. They are floating small sticks along the water and cheering when the current carries them quickly beneath the arch. A boy crouches beside the stream and points to a patch of watercress growing along the bank. He pulls a handful from the water and proudly announces that his mother sometimes adds it to soup. Wild plants like watercress occasionally appeared in famine diets when cultivated food grew scarce. The children pass the leafy stems around, tasting the peppery flavour with curious expressions. Their curiosity remains strong even in difficult times. Further down the path, a group of older boys is helping a farmer repair a wooden fence. They work with surprising seriousness, lifting posts and hammering nails, while the farmer gives instructions. The boys look proud of the responsibility. Work has always been part of life for young people here, yet you can see that the balance between work and play is slowly shifting. Meals are becoming smaller. Parents worry more openly about the coming winter. Children sense these changes even when adults try to shield them. One interesting detail preserved in several memoirs from the period describes how children sometimes created imaginative games using everyday objects from rural life. Pieces of peat sticks and stones could become toys in the hands of creative young minds. You see this creativity now as two girls build a tiny model cottage beside the road using pebbles and grass. They carefully arrange the stones to form walls, while a flat piece of bark becomes the roof. Their tiny house looks surprisingly convincing. When one girl places a small twig beside the door and declares it a chimney, both children burst into quiet laughter. Moments like this offer brief glimpses of normal childhood in a time that is becoming increasingly uncertain. Later in the afternoon, you follow several children walking toward the small parish school at the edge of the village. The building is modest, built from stone with a narrow doorway and simple wooden benches inside. A teacher waits near the entrance, greeting each student. Education during this time varies widely across rural Ireland. Some children attend small local schools where they learn reading, writing and basic arithmetic. Others receive little formal education due to family responsibilities or distance from schools. Today the classroom feels quieter than usual. Several children who normally attend are absent, likely helping their families manage the damaged harvest. Still, the teacher begins the lesson. He writes letters on a slate board, while the students copy them carefully onto small handheld slates of their own. The scratching sound of chalk fills the room. For a short time, the outside worries fade slightly. Learning offers a different kind of nourishment. As the sun begins lowering behind the hills, the children leave the school and scatter once more along the village paths. Some head home to help with chores. Others linger beside the stream for one last game before supper. You watch them run across the fields with energy that seems almost endless. Even as famine slowly spreads across Ireland, childhood continues finding small spaces for laughter, curiosity and play. Yet beneath those moments of innocence, the changing world around them will soon demand far more resilience than any child should have to learn so early. The village settles into evening once again, and the fading light stretches long shadows across the damp fields. You walk slowly along the narrow path that leads toward the small stone church, standing on a gentle rise above the cottages. The church is not large. Its walls are built from rough grey stone, and the wooden door creaks softly when opened. A simple bell tower rises above the roof, though the bell itself is small compared with those found in larger towns. Still, the building holds an important place in the life of the village. As you approach, you notice people arriving quietly from different directions. Some walk alone. Others come in small groups of family members. Their footsteps crunch softly on the gravel path leading to the entrance. Inside, candles flicker along the walls, casting warm golden light across wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. You slip into a seat near the back. A priest stands at the front of the room, speaking in a calm, steady voice. His words echo gently against the stone walls as the villagers listen. Faith has long played a central role in rural Irish communities. For many people, the church provides not only spiritual guidance, but also a place to gather, share news, and seek comfort during difficult times. Tonight, the mood inside the church feels thoughtful. The priest speaks about patience and endurance. He reminds the congregation that hardship has visited many generations before them. Some people bow their heads while listening. Others stare quietly at the flickering candles. One well-established historical point is that religion remained deeply woven into everyday life across Ireland during the 19th century. Catholic churches in particular often served as community centres where people met regularly for worship and social connection. You notice a woman near the front clutching a set of worn prayer beads between her fingers. Her lips move silently as she whispers a prayer. Nearby, an older man closes his eyes and sits very still. The quiet atmosphere inside the church contrasts sharply with the worries waiting outside its doors. Yet for a short while, the space offers a sense of calm. After the service ends, many villagers remain inside talking quietly with one another. Conversations drift between family news, weather patterns, and the condition of the potato fields. Some people light additional candles near a small statue at the side of the church. You watch as a mother lifts her child so the boy can place a coin in a small offering box. Moments like this reveal how deeply spiritual habits are woven into daily routines. Outside the church, dusk has deepened into night. The air feels cool, and the first stars appear faintly above the hills. A small group gathers near the stone wall surrounding the churchyard. They speak softly about the coming winter and what it may bring. One man says that he believes next year's crop will surely recover. Another suggests planting potatoes in a different field might avoid the disease. The uncertainty surrounding the blight continues shaping these conversations. Modern researchers still examine how religious belief influenced the way many Irish communities responded emotionally to the famine. For some people, faith provided a framework that helped them endure suffering and maintain hope. For others, the disaster raised painful questions about why such hardship had arrived. You walk slowly through the churchyard where old gravestones lean slightly in the uneven ground. Moss covers many of the inscriptions, making the names difficult to read in the fading light. The quiet setting encourages reflection. Life here has always been tied closely to the land. Generations have planted crops, built cottages, and raised families on these same hills. Now the land itself seems to be changing. Near the gate, you encounter a small group of villagers sharing a story about a curious belief that has begun circulating in nearby parishes. Some people claim that certain herbs placed in the corners of potato fields might protect the plants from disease. The idea may sound unusual, but folk traditions often appear during times of uncertainty. Throughout rural Ireland, communities have long relied on herbal remedies and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. One interesting detail mentioned in local folklore suggests that farmers sometimes carried small charms or blessed objects into their fields during planting season, believing these items might bring protection or good fortune to their crops. Whether such practices had any real effect is difficult to say, but they reflect the human desire to find control during events that feel unpredictable. As you leave the churchyard and begin walking back toward the cottages, the quiet countryside stretches around you under a sky now filled with stars. The village lights glow softly in the distance. Inside those homes, families are gathering near their hearth fires, finishing their evening meals and preparing for sleep. Children drift toward their beds. Parents sit for a while longer discussing plans for the days ahead. Some speak about saving more potatoes for winter. Others wonder whether government assistance might arrive if the blight continues next year. The night air carries the faint sound of wind moving through the damaged fields. You pause for a moment and look back toward the church standing silent against the dark hillside. For many people in the village, that small building represents more than just a place of worship. It offers a sense of meaning during uncertain times. And as the famine story continues unfolding across Ireland, that sense of meaning will remain one of the quiet threads helping communities endure the long and difficult years ahead. Morning arrives beneath a sky that looks almost white with cloud. The light spreads slowly across the hills as you step outside the cottage, drawing in the cool air that carries the smell of damp grass and peat smoke. Somewhere nearby, a rooster calls out again, though the sound feels softer today, as if the countryside itself is waking cautiously. You wander down the narrow lane toward the fields where several farmers have gathered around a patch of potato plants that look particularly damaged. The leaves hang limp and darken their edges, curling inward like burned paper. A man kneels beside the plants and examines the stems with careful attention. But this time the conversation sounds different. Instead of discussing the disease alone, the farmers are sharing ideas about how it might be stopped. People often begin searching for remedies when the cause of a problem remains mysterious. One farmer insists he heard about a treatment used in another county. According to the story, sprinkling lime across the soil might prevent the disease from spreading. Another man claims that cutting away the affected leaves early could save the remaining plants. A third shakes his head and suggests that the disease comes from the air itself, meaning no soil treatment would make much difference. The discussion continues as each person offers another possibility. Across Ireland, during the early years of the potato blight, farmers experimented with a wide variety of methods in hopes of protecting their crops. Because the nature of the disease was poorly understood, many treatments relied on observation, rumour, or traditional agricultural practices. You watch as one farmer carefully sprinkles a small amount of powdered lime around the base of several plants. He says he read about the idea in a newspaper brought from Dublin. Whether the treatment will help remains uncertain. Nearby, another farmer is trying something entirely different. He removes the worst-looking plants from his field and piles them into a small heap beside the stone wall. Soon, he sets the pile on fire. The smoke drifts slowly upward into the grey sky. His reasoning seems straightforward. If the disease spreads from plant to plant, destroying the infected ones might prevent further damage. It is a logical thought, but the blight travels through invisible spores carried by wind and moisture, something the farmers cannot see. You continue walking through the fields, noticing how many rows have already been cleared, where farmers attempted to salvage what potatoes they could. Some sections still show green plants that appear healthy for now. Others stand empty, the soil turned over and abandoned. A particularly curious story begins circulating among the villagers during these weeks. Someone claims that certain varieties of seaweed placed around potato plants might protect them from the disease. The idea likely came from the long tradition of coastal farmers using seaweed as fertilizer. A group of younger men has even collected a cartload from the nearby shore and spread it across part of their field. The sharp scent of salt and ocean hangs over the soil. Whether the seaweed will make any difference remains to be seen. These experiments reflect the determination of farmers who are not ready to surrender their crops without trying every possible solution. You sit on a stone wall and watch as another group debates the situation with growing intensity. One man believes the disease arrived from another country on ships carrying imported goods. Another argues that unusual weather patterns must have weakened the plants. He points toward the grey sky and says the summer rains were heavier than usual. Today we understand that the potato blight did indeed spread across Europe through a combination of infected plants and favourable weather conditions. The organism responsible thrives in cool, damp environments, making Ireland particularly vulnerable. But for the people standing here in the field, the explanation remains hidden. They see only the results, and the results are alarming. One well-established piece of historical evidence shows that the blight spread with remarkable speed across Ireland during the autumn of 1845. In many counties, entire fields that looked healthy early in the season deteriorated rapidly within a matter of weeks. You walk farther along the edge of the field where two older farmers are speaking quietly. One of them remembers hearing about crop diseases in earlier years, though nothing this destructive. He wonders aloud whether planting potatoes again next season will bring the same disaster. The other man shrugs slowly. No one knows. Modern historians continue examining how communities responded to the first appearance of the blight. Some families experimented with new farming methods, while others waited to see if the next year's crop would return to normal. Hope remains a powerful force. Even when evidence suggests danger, people often hold on to the belief that the problem might pass. By afternoon, the clouds begin breaking slightly, allowing a pale sun to shine across the fields. Farmers continue their efforts. Some burn infected plants. Others spread lime or seaweed. A few simply stand quietly beside their fields, studying the leaves, as though they might reveal some secret. You leave the fields and walk back toward the village where the smell of cooking drifts gently from several cottages. Inside one home, a pot of cabbage and potatoes bubbles slowly over the fire. The meal looks familiar, though the portions seem smaller than they once were. At the table, a man explains to his family that he plans to try planting a small section of oats next spring in case the potatoes fail again. His wife listens carefully. The children remain quiet while eating. Small changes like this are beginning to shape the future. Outside the cottage window, the damaged potato plants move gently in the wind. The farmers continue searching for solutions, but the quiet truth spreading across Ireland's countryside is becoming harder to ignore. The blight does not seem ready to disappear, and the experiments happening in these fields may soon prove too small to stop what is coming. The first real chill of winter arrives quietly. You notice it early one morning when you step outside the cottage and see a thin layer of frost resting across the grass. The fields shimmer faintly in the pale light, each blade of grass outlined in white. Your breath forms small clouds as you inhale the cold air. Winter in Ireland rarely brings deep snow in this region, but the damp cold has a way of creeping into bones and cottages alike. The village moves more slowly now. Smoke rises from chimneys earlier in the day as families keep their fires burning longer. The smell of peat smoke hangs in the air, almost constantly drifting across the stone walls and narrow lanes. You wrap your coat tighter and walk toward the fields. Most of the potato plants have already been cleared away, leaving the land bare and dark beneath the grey sky. Farmers finished digging the remaining harvest weeks ago, storing what they could in pits lined with straw and soil. Now those hidden stores beneath the ground hold the village's winter food supply. You pass a group of men repairing the cover of one such storage pit. They carefully pack soil over the top, hoping to protect the potatoes from frost. Potato pits were a common storage method used by rural families throughout Ireland. The tubers were placed in shallow trenches and covered with layers of straw and earth to keep them cool and insulated during colder months. If the pit remained dry and well protected, the potatoes could last through much of the winter. But this year, uncertainty lingers over every pit. The rot that appeared in the fields sometimes continues spreading even after the potatoes are stored. You kneel beside one pit where a farmer has just uncovered part of the supply to inspect it. He lifts a potato and slices it open with a small knife. For a moment, everyone watches closely. The inside looks clean. A small sigh of relief passes through the group. Not every potato has been lost. Yet when the farmer cuts open the next one, faint brown streaks appear beneath the skin. The rot has followed them underground. You stand slowly brushing soil from your hands. This quiet inspection scene is repeating across the countryside as winter approaches. Some families discover that their stored potatoes remain mostly healthy. Others find that large portions of their food supply have spoiled. The results vary from village to village. One widely accepted historical observation is that the first year of the blight did not destroy every potato in Ireland. Many areas still harvested enough to survive the winter of 1845 and early 1846, though supplies were often much smaller than usual. That uneven survival allowed hope to persist for a time. You walk back toward the cottages, where several families are stacking additional peat beside their doors. Fuel becomes especially important during winter months. Peat fires provide warmth, cooking heat, and sometimes the only light inside cottages during long evenings. A boy drags a bundle of peat blocks across the yard while his father arranges them in neat rows beside the wall. The blocks look dark and rough, almost like bricks cut from the earth. One interesting detail about peat is that it burns slowly compared with wood, producing a steady heat that can last for hours. The smoke carries a distinctive scent that many visitors to Ireland remember long after leaving. Inside one cottage, the hearth fire glows warmly. You sit near it while a woman prepares supper. Tonight the meal includes boiled potatoes again, though fewer than usual. She adds cabbage and a small handful of oats to the pot, thickening the mixture into a hearty stew. Stretching ingredients has become more common as winter settles in. At the table, the family eats quietly. Outside, the wind has begun rising, rattling the door gently against its wooden frame. Someone mentions that several travellers passed through the village earlier that day on their way toward a larger town. Roads remain busy even in cold weather. People continue searching for work relief or family members who might help them through the winter. You step outside again after the meal and notice the sky has cleared slightly. Stars glitter above the hills, bright against the dark sky. The cold air carries sound clearly across the fields. Somewhere a dog barks in the distance. A cartwheel creaks slowly along the road. Despite the quiet beauty of the night, worry still sits quietly In the minds of many villagers, how long will the stored potatoes last? Will next year's crop grow normally, or will the strange disease return again? Modern historians still examine how communities interpreted the first winter after the blight appeared. Many rural families believed that although the harvest had been poor, the worst might already be behind them. After all, enough food remained in many regions to reach spring. Hope, even cautious hope, remained alive. You walk toward the edge of the village where the fields stretch dark beneath the stars. The soil rests quietly through the winter months. Beneath it lie the buried potato pits that now hold the fate of countless families. For the moment, the land appears peaceful, but deep within the memory of the fields, the blight has already taken root. And when spring arrives again, the farmers of Ireland will discover whether the coming harvest will restore their lives or deepen the hunger that has only just begun. Winter deepens as the weeks pass. The fields around the village remain quiet beneath low grey skies, and the wind drifting in from the Atlantic carries a damp chill that seeps slowly through clothing and stone walls alike. When you step outside in the morning, frost clings to the edges of the hedges, and the narrow lanes are slick with frozen mud. Inside the cottages, the fires burn almost constantly now. Peat blocks crackle softly in the hearths, while families gather close to the warmth. The rooms glow with a dim orange light, the smoke curling upward through the thatched roofs before fading into the cold air outside. You sit near one of these fires while several neighbours discuss news that has recently arrived from the larger towns. Word has come that officials in Dublin and London are beginning to consider how to respond to the spreading crop failure. The information travels slowly through newspapers, travelling merchants, and letters carried along muddy roads. By the time it reaches small villages like this one, the details often sound uncertain. Still, people listen carefully. Across Ireland in the mid-1840s, government leaders were receiving reports about the potato blight damaging crops in many counties. Administrators responsible for overseeing relief programs began discussing possible responses to the growing problem. Some proposed importing additional grain to supplement the lost potato harvest. Others believed that existing market systems would eventually balance supply and demand without heavy government involvement. These debates were happening far away in offices and meeting rooms, yet their outcomes would shape life in villages like this one. You follow the conversation as a farmer unfolds a crinkled newspaper brought from town. He reads aloud a short article describing a government plan to purchase maize, a type of corn commonly grown in North America. The idea is that maize might be distributed to regions suffering food shortages. The villagers listen with mixed reactions. Some nod hopefully at the possibility of new food supplies. Others seem unsure. Maize is not commonly eaten here, and many people have never cooked it before. One curious detail mentioned in several historical accounts is that when maize first arrived in Ireland during the famine years, many families struggled to prepare it properly. The grain required grinding or careful cooking methods unfamiliar to people accustomed to boiling potatoes. In some places, poorly prepared maize caused stomach discomfort, leading to early suspicion about the new food. Yet despite these challenges, maize would eventually become an important relief food during the famine. You watch as the newspaper is passed carefully from one pair of hands to another. The printed words carry the distant voice of government policy into this quiet village, but policy often moves slowly. Another man explains that public works projects may soon begin in certain counties. These programs would offer wages to labourers willing to work on building roads, drainage systems, and other infrastructure. The idea is simple. People earn money through labour, then use that money to buy food. This approach reflects a common belief among policymakers of the time that providing employment rather than direct charity would preserve dignity while supporting struggling populations. You step outside the cottage and walk toward the road where several men are discussing whether such work might appear in this region. If road construction begins nearby, it could provide income during the difficult months ahead. But no one knows exactly when or where these projects will start. Researchers examining this period often explore how different political philosophies shaped government responses to the famine. Some leaders believed that markets should remain largely free from interference, while others argued that stronger direct relief measures were necessary. These disagreements sometimes delayed decisions at a time when speed mattered greatly. You continue walking through the village where the afternoon light has begun fading behind thick clouds. A small group gathers near the crossroads where the soup pot once stood earlier in the season. Today the fire is smaller, but a pot still hangs above it. Inside simmers a mixture of oats and cabbage. The meal is modest, yet it offers warmth against the winter cold. A man beside the fire says he heard that maize shipments may arrive in nearby ports soon. Another wonders whether their village will receive any portion of the supply. Hope and uncertainty mix together in the conversation. Later that evening you return to the cottage, where the family sits close to the hearth finishing their meal. The wind outside has grown stronger, rattling the wooden shutters against the stone walls. Someone mentions that if government grain arrives soon, perhaps the village will manage through the winter without too much hardship. Another voice quietly adds that the real test will come when farmers plant their next potato crop in spring. Everyone understands the meaning behind that statement. If the blight returns next season, the consequences may be far worse. You stare into the glowing embers of the fire. The flames shift slowly, sending small sparks upward through the smoke hole in the roof. Beyond the cottage walls, winter wind sweeps across fields where the soil rests beneath frost. Somewhere far away, ships carrying maize begin their long journey toward Irish ports. Government officials continue debating policies. Farmers continue waiting, and the fate of the next harvest remains hidden beneath the frozen ground. Winter stretches on slow and quiet across the Irish countryside. When you step outside the cottage one early morning, the sky hangs low and pale above the hills, and the wind carries the cold scent of damp soil and distant sea spray. Frost glitters faintly along the edges of the stone walls, and the fields appear still almost resting after the long growing season that brought so much disappointment. You walk toward the farmland where potato rows once filled the landscape with thick green leaves. Now the ground lies bare. Without the rustling plants that once covered the soil, the countryside feels strangely silent. The wind moves freely across the open fields, whispering through the dry grass and broken stems left behind after harvest. You pause beside one of the empty plots where the earth has been turned and smoothed by recent frost. In years before the blight, winter fields often carried signs of preparation for the next planting season. Farmers might spread manure across the soil or repair drainage channels to ensure healthy crops when spring returned. But this winter, many fields remain untouched. Some farmers are uncertain whether planting potatoes again will be wise. Others simply lack the energy or resources to begin planning the next harvest. This hesitation is visible across wide parts of Ireland during the early famine years. The potato had long been the central crop for millions of rural people. Yet the sudden appearance of blight introduced a new and frightening unpredictability. You continue along the path and notice something else unusual in the landscape. Several small animal pens stand empty. Livestock numbers in some villages have begun to decline. A farmer explains quietly that he sold his pig earlier in the season to help cover rent payments and purchase grain. Without the extra animal to feed his household, now depends even more heavily on stored potatoes and whatever vegetables remain in the garden. This pattern appears in many rural communities during difficult harvest years. Selling animals provides quick money but removes an important source of food or income later. You step carefully across a narrow wooden gate and enter another field where a few sheep still graze along the hillside. Their wool looks thick and slightly matted from the damp winter air. The shepherd watching them leans on his staff and nods as you approach. He explains that he plans to keep the sheep for wool rather than meat, hoping that selling fleece in the spring market might bring needed coins. The choices facing farmers have become complicated. Every decision seems to trade one form of security for another. You walk farther along the hillside where the view opens across the valley. From here, you can see several clusters of cottages scattered among the fields. Thin lines of smoke rise from their chimneys, drifting slowly into the grey sky. The scene looks peaceful from a distance, but the quiet landscape hides many small struggles happening inside those homes. A lesser-known observation from several travellers who visited Ireland during the famine years describes how quickly the countryside could appear empty during winter. With fewer crops growing and fewer animals in the fields, the land sometimes seemed strangely silent compared with the lively scenes of summer. You notice that stillness now. The usual sounds of farming activity are absent. No carts carry harvest loads across the roads. No workers call to one another across the fields. Only the wind moves steadily through the hedges. You return toward the village where several men are repairing tools inside a small shed. Their breath forms white clouds in the cold air as they work. One sharpens a spade against a stone wheel, while another mends the handle of a wooden rake. Tool repair becomes an important winter task in farming communities. Keeping equipment ready ensures that when planting season arrives, work can begin quickly. Yet even this preparation carries a shadow of uncertainty. One man remarks that if the blight returns in spring, all this effort might be wasted. The others nod quietly. Modern scholars continue examining how the potato famine changed long-established farming practices in Ireland. Some farmers began experimenting with different crops or planting methods after witnessing how vulnerable a single dominant crop could be. But such changes required time, resources, and land that many tenant families did not possess. You leave the shed and walk toward the edge of the village where the road leads past several abandoned cottages. Their doors hang slightly open. Roof thatch has begun to sag in places where no one remains to repair it. A neighbour explains that the families who once lived there moved to a larger town earlier in the winter in search of work. Migration during the famine years often happened gradually. Some households left first hoping to find opportunities elsewhere. Others remained behind, watching carefully to see whether conditions might improve. The empty cottages stand as quiet reminders of those decisions. As evening approaches, you return to the warmth of the hearth inside the cottage. The fire glows steadily while supper cooks in the iron pot. Tonight, the meal includes potatoes again, though the quantity is smaller than earlier in the winter. Each one is examined carefully before being placed into the pot. Outside, darkness spreads across the quiet valley. The wind continues its slow journey across the fields, moving through land that now waits for spring. But when the soil warms again and the next planting begins, the farmers of Ireland will face a difficult question. Will the potato fields return to life as they once did? Or will the silence of these winter fields carry forward into another season of uncertainty? For now, the land rests, and the answer remains hidden beneath the cold earth. The winter days move slowly, each one blending gently into the next. When you step outside the cottage one morning, the sky has the pale colour of early frost, and the ground crunches softly beneath your boots. The fields stretch quietly toward the hills, their soil dark and resting, while thin smoke trails drift upward from the scattered cottages. At first glance, the village appears calm. But along the road that leads past the farms, something unusual is happening. You notice a small crowd gathered beside a cottage near the edge of the lane. People stand silently watching. As you approach, the reason becomes clear. A cart waits beside the cottage door, and two men are removing the wooden frame of the roof. The thatch is being pulled down. The family who once lived here stands nearby with a few bundles of belongings tied in cloth. Their faces are tired but composed. A woman holds a small child while an older boy grips a walking stick almost as tall as himself. The cottage is being dismantled. In parts of Ireland, during the famine years, eviction sometimes took this form. When tenants could no longer pay rent, landlords or their agents occasionally ordered cottages to be pulled down after the occupants left. Removing the roof ensured that the house could not be reoccupied. The sight is deeply unsettling. You watch as the men climb onto the low stone walls and begin pulling away the thick straw thatch. The roof collapses inward with a soft rustling sound. Dust and bits of straw drift through the cold air. The family gathers their belongings quietly. No one argues. No one raises their voice. The moment feels heavy enough without words. One historically documented reality of the famine era is that many tenant farmers struggled to meet rent payments after repeated crop failures. When rent could not be paid, some landlords resorted to eviction in order to reclaim or reorganise their land. These events did not occur everywhere in the same way. Some estates offered temporary relief, while others enforced strict rent collection policies. The experiences of tenants varied widely depending on local conditions and the decisions of estate managers. You step aside as the family begins walking slowly down the road. The boy turns once to glance back at the cottage where he grew up. Now the roof lies scattered across the ground. The walls remain standing, but the home itself is no longer livable. An unusual detail recorded in several contemporary accounts describes how neighbours sometimes helped evicted families gather their belongings or offered temporary shelter before they continued their journey. You notice this kindness here as well. A woman from a nearby cottage approaches the displaced family and presses a small loaf of bread into the mother's hands. Another neighbour offers to carry one of the bundles for part of the road. Small gestures like these cannot replace what has been lost, but they provide comfort during painful moments. You follow the road a short distance as the family walks away from the village. Their pace is slow. The father pulls a small cart carrying blankets and cooking tools. The wheels creak softly against the frozen dirt. They are not sure where they will go yet. Perhaps to a larger town where work might be found. Perhaps to relatives in another county. The road ahead holds only uncertainty. When you return toward the village, the small crowd has begun dispersing. The ruined cottage remains behind. Without its roof, the interior lies exposed to the cold sky. The hearth where meals were once cooked sits dark and silent. Scenes like this appear in many parts of Ireland during the famine years. Each empty home represents a family forced to leave land that may have supported generations before them. Researchers continue discussing how eviction patterns varied across different regions and estates during the famine. While some landlords attempted to reduce rents or provide assistance, others believed consolidating smaller farms into larger holdings might improve agricultural efficiency. These economic decisions often collided with the human reality of families losing their homes. You walk slowly along the lane as the afternoon light begins fading. The wind moves gently through the broken roof thatch scattered across the ground. Nearby another cottage still stands intact. Smoke rises from its chimney while a child runs through the yard chasing a dog. Life continues beside loss. You pause beside the ruined house and look inside. The packed earth floor remains visible. A wooden stool sits overturned near the hearth. For a moment it is easy to imagine the family who once gathered here during long winter evenings. The laughter of children, the quiet conversations beside the fire, all of it now carried away along the road. As darkness settles across the countryside, you return to the warmth of the cottage where the hearth fire burns steadily. Inside supper is being prepared. Potatoes simmer in the pot once again. But tonight the meal feels quieter. Someone mentions the family who left earlier that day. The room grows silent for a moment. Everyone understands how easily circumstances could change. Outside, the wind sweeps across the valley where empty cottages now stand beside occupied ones. And with each passing week, the number of homes left behind will continue to grow. A few weeks later, the village receives something rare, a letter. You notice the excitement almost immediately. News travels quickly in small rural communities, especially when it arrives from across the ocean. When you step outside the cottage that morning, several neighbours are already gathered near the lane speaking in animated voices. The letter has come from America. It belongs to the O'Donnell family who live in the cottage near the bend in the road. Their eldest son left Ireland 3 years ago, sailing from a crowded port in hopes of finding work abroad. Now his words have returned. You follow the small crowd as they walk toward the O'Donnell cottage. The door stands open, and inside the room the family sits around the table while the letter is carefully unfolded. Paper like this is precious. Letters crossing the Atlantic travel slowly by ship, often taking weeks to arrive. By the time the message reaches the village, the writer may already be living a very different life than the one described on the page. Still, every sentence feels important. The father begins reading aloud. His son writes about New York, a city far larger than anything most people in this village can imagine. He describes streets filled with carts and horses, tall buildings crowded close together, and ships arriving daily from distant countries. Work, he says, can be found there if a man is willing to labour hard. He writes that he has been employed unloading cargo along the docks. The work is heavy but steady, and most importantly, food is plentiful. At this last detail, the room grows especially quiet. For families facing uncertain harvests, the idea of a place where food remains abundant feels almost unbelievable. Large numbers of Irish people had already begun emigrating before the famine, years travelling to Britain, Canada, and the United States in search of opportunity. These earlier migrants often sent letters back home, describing their experiences abroad. Such letters sometimes encourage relatives to follow. You watch as the O'Donnell father continues reading. The son explains that he shares a small room with several other Irish labourers. The space is cramped, but he says they manage well enough. He includes a few coins inside the envelope, a small amount of money saved from his wages. The coins are passed carefully around the table. They shine faintly in the firelight. Money sent home from relatives working abroad would become an important lifeline for many Irish families during the famine years. Even small sums could help purchase food or pay rent during difficult seasons. You notice the mother wiping her eyes quietly while listening. Her son is far away, yet his letter brings comfort. When the reading ends, neighbours begin asking questions. What does the city look like? Is the journey across the ocean dangerous? Are there many other Irish people there? The father answers as best he can using the information from the letter. Ships, he explains, leave regularly from ports like Cork and Liverpool. The crossing takes several weeks depending on weather. Many passengers are young men and women seeking work. One curious detail mentioned in some surviving letters from Irish emigrants describes their amazement upon seeing American cities for the first time. Tall buildings, busy harbours and large markets created a striking contrast with the quiet agricultural villages they had left behind. You step outside the cottage as the afternoon light spreads across the hills. The letter continues circulating through the village as people take turns reading its lines. Each person imagines the distant place described in those words. A land where wages can be earned. A land where food remains available. A land where the potato blight has not followed. Some villagers begin quietly discussing the possibility of leaving. For now, these conversations remain cautious. Travel across the Atlantic requires money for passage. Not every family can afford such a journey. Yet the idea has entered the village. Hope sometimes arrives disguised as ink on a folded page. Researchers studying Irish emigration often note that letters from earlier migrants played a powerful role in shaping decisions during the famine. Descriptions of opportunity abroad help convince many families that leaving might offer a path to survival. As evening approaches, you walk back toward the crossroads, where several men stand discussing the letter's contents. One of them wonders aloud whether he might save enough money to send his eldest son overseas next year. Another man says he has heard that ships leaving for America are becoming crowded with passengers. No one yet knows how many people will soon choose that path. But the conversation itself marks an important shift. For generations, life in this village has revolved around the land. Now some people are beginning to imagine a future far beyond these fields. The sun sinks slowly behind the hills, casting long shadows across the quiet road. Inside the cottages, families prepare their evening meals. The letter rests folded carefully on the O'Donnell table, its paper already worn slightly from so many hands passing it around. But the message it carries continues echoing through the village. Across the ocean lies another world, and for some people, here that distant world may soon become their only chance for a new beginning. The idea of leaving begins quietly. At first, it appears only in small conversations, the kind that happen beside the hearth after supper or along the road when neighbours pause beside a stone wall. You notice it in the careful way people speak about distant places, as though the words themselves might carry both hope and risk. America, Canada, Liverpool. These names drift through the village like unfamiliar birds passing overhead. You are sitting near the fire in the cottage one evening when the subject returns again. The wind taps gently against the wooden shutters, and the room glows with the warm orange light of the peat fire. The father of the household sits at the table counting a few coins he has saved. Not many, but enough to make the conversation serious. He says quietly that if the potato crop fails again next year, he may have no choice but to send one of the children abroad. The room falls silent for a moment. Travel across the Atlantic is not a small decision. It means weeks aboard a crowded ship, uncertain work in a foreign land, and the possibility that families may never see one another again. Yet the alternative is becoming harder to ignore. A widely accepted historical observation is that the Great Famine eventually triggered one of the largest waves of emigration in Irish history. Millions of people would leave the island over the following decades, many of them travelling to North America in search of work and food. But here in the early stage of the crisis, the decision still feels new. You step outside into the cool night air. Above the hills, clouds drift slowly across a sky full of stars. The countryside is quiet except for the distant bark of a dog and the occasional creak of a cart wheel somewhere along the road. You walk toward the edge of the village where two men are speaking beside a gate. They are discussing the cost of passage on a ship. One man says he heard that tickets from Cork to Quebec can sometimes be purchased for a modest sum if the ship is already transporting cargo. The other nods, but points out that the journey itself carries risks. Storms can delay ships for weeks. Crowded conditions on board sometimes lead to illness. Still, people continue to consider the possibility. An interesting detail preserved in several emigrant accounts from the 19th century describes how some travellers carried small bundles containing soil from their home fields. The soil served as a reminder of the land they were leaving behind. The gesture may sound symbolic, but for families deeply connected to the land, it carried emotional meaning. You continue walking along the path that leads toward the hill overlooking the valley. From here you can see the scattered lights of cottages glowing faintly in the darkness. Each light represents a family weighing difficult choices. Inside one of those homes, a mother may be quietly packing belongings in case a child departs for the port. Inside another, parents may be debating whether to stay and hope that the next harvest brings relief. The uncertainty touches everyone differently. You sit on a stone wall and listen to the wind moving gently through the hedges. Across Ireland during these early famine months, similar conversations were happening in thousands of villages. Some families decided quickly that emigration offered the best chance for survival. Others hesitated, hoping that the blight might disappear with the next planting season. Researchers examining this period continue exploring how those decisions unfolded within households. Economic necessity often played a role, but emotional ties to home, family and land also influenced whether people chose to remain or depart. No single answer fits every story. You return to the cottage where the fire still burns steadily. The family has begun discussing practical details. If someone leaves, who will travel? The eldest son might have the strength to find work abroad, but sending him means losing one of the strongest workers on the farm. Another possibility would be for a daughter to travel as a domestic servant in a large city. Yet that option carries its own uncertainties. Each choice brings both opportunity and sacrifice. The conversation stretches late into the evening while the fire slowly burns lower in the hearth. Outside, the night grows colder. You step to the door once more before going to sleep. Far beyond the dark hills lies the ocean, where ships move quietly across the waves, carrying passengers between continents. Soon, some of those ships will fill with people from villages like this one. For now, however, the idea of leaving still exists, mostly in whispers. But as the famine deepens and hope for the next harvest grows uncertain, those whispers will soon turn into decisions that change the lives of countless families forever. Spring approaches slowly. The first signs appear in small ways. A faint softness returns to the wind moving across the hills. Frost lingers for shorter periods each morning. The fields that looked frozen and lifeless through winter begin to darken as the soil warms beneath the pale sunlight. You walk through the village one morning and notice farmers already stepping back into their fields. Planting season is coming. Despite the damage caused by the blight, many families still depend on potatoes as their primary crop. There are few alternatives that can produce as much food from such small plots of land. The decision to plant again carries both hope and anxiety. You follow a farmer into his field as he pushes his spade into the soil. The earth turns easily soft from recent rain. He kneels and begins placing seed potatoes carefully into the furrow before covering them with loose soil. Each small piece of potato contains the possibility of new plants, but the memory of the previous harvest lingers. Across Ireland in the spring of 1846, farmers replanted millions of acres with potatoes, despite knowing the blight might return. For many households, abandoning the crop entirely would have meant abandoning the only reliable food source they had ever known. You watch as several neighbours work together along the rows. The rhythm of planting feels almost comforting. Dig, place the seed, cover with soil. Repeat. These motions have been practiced for generations, yet the quiet tension remains. A man nearby pauses and wipes sweat from his brow, even though the morning air is still cool. He stares across the newly planted rows as if trying to imagine the future. Will these plants grow strong, or will the strange disease return again? An unusual agricultural practice, sometimes mentioned in accounts from this period, involves farmers selecting the healthiest looking potatoes from their stored supplies as seed for the next planting. The hope was that stronger plants might resist the disease better. Whether this method helped was uncertain. The blight did not care how carefully farmers chose their seed. You walk along the edge of the field where a woman spreads manure across the soil using a wooden rake. Fertilizing the ground has always been part of preparing for a healthy crop. Nearby children carry baskets filled with small potato pieces cut from larger tubers. They drop the pieces into shallow holes while their parents follow behind, covering them with earth. The entire family participates in the work. A fact widely recognized by historians is that family labour formed the backbone of Irish small-scale farming during the 19th century. Planting, harvesting and tending crops relied heavily on the combined efforts of parents and children working together. As midday approaches, the sun climbs higher through thin clouds. Birds return to the hedgerows, singing loudly as if celebrating the arrival of warmer weather. For a moment the fields feel alive again. You sit on a stone wall and watch the rows slowly fill with newly planted seeds. Hope rises quietly in the hearts of the farmers. Perhaps the blight was only a single bad season. Perhaps this year's harvest will return to normal. But not everyone shares the same confidence. One older farmer stands at the edge of his field, shaking his head slowly. He explains that he plans to plant a smaller portion of potatoes this year and use the rest of his land for oats. The decision feels cautious but understandable. Modern historians continue discussing how farmers responded to the second planting season after the blight first appeared. Some attempted to diversify their crops, while many others remained dependent on potatoes due to the limitations of land and resources. Change, even when necessary, can be difficult to implement quickly. You walk farther down the lane where the sound of carts echoes faintly through the air. Several families are preparing to travel toward the coast. The decision to emigrate has already begun for some. Bundles of clothing and household tools are stacked beside the carts. Chickens cluck nervously inside wooden crates. A young woman hugs her mother tightly before climbing onto the cart. Their faces show both determination and sadness. Ships are waiting in the ports. News of opportunity abroad continues spreading through letters and stories carried from town to town. The planting season and the emigration season now overlap in strange ways. Some people dig seed potatoes into the soil hoping for a better harvest. Others leave the land entirely. You watch as the cart begins rolling slowly down the road toward the distant harbour. The wheels creak softly against the gravel. The family sitting aboard turns once to look back at the village before disappearing around a bend in the lane. Meanwhile, behind you, farmers continue planting their fields. The soil receives each small seed potato with quiet patience. Spring has returned. Green shoots will soon rise from the earth again. But beneath the surface of the soil, the memory of last year's disease still lingers. And as the new crop begins to grow across Ireland's countryside, no one yet knows whether the coming harvest will bring relief or deepen the crisis that has already begun reshaping the lives of millions. Spring gradually spreads its soft green colour across the countryside. The hedges thicken with new leaves and birds return in lively numbers, filling the air with song each morning. When you step outside the cottage now, the damp chill of winter has faded, replaced by a gentle warmth that promises another growing season. The potato plants are beginning to appear. You walk along the narrow path toward the fields where the first small shoots push through the soil. Their pale green leaves unfold carefully beneath the sunlight. From a distance, the rows look delicate, almost fragile. Farmers move quietly between the young plants, inspecting them with cautious attention. The memory of the previous year's destruction has not faded, yet life continues and crops must grow. You kneel beside one row and brush a little soil away from the base of a plant. The stem feels strong. The leaves look healthy. For now at least, everything appears normal. Across much of Ireland during the spring of 1846, the potato crop initially seemed promising. Fields filled once again with green plants, and many farmers began hoping that the disaster of the previous harvest had been a temporary misfortune. Hope can grow quickly when conditions appear favourable. You stand and look across the valley where the fields shimmer in the sunlight. The landscape looks almost exactly as it did before the blight first appeared. Children run along the paths. Farmers repair fences. Carts roll slowly between cottages carrying tools and baskets. Life feels familiar again, but not everyone remains. As you walk through the village, you notice several cottages standing empty. Their doors hang loosely on their hinges, and weeds have begun creeping along the stone walls. The absence of smoke rising from their chimneys feels noticeable. Those families left during the winter months. Some travelled to nearby towns seeking work. Others continued all the way to the coast and boarded ships heading across the Atlantic. The quiet departure of neighbours has begun changing the shape of the community. An unusual observation recorded by several travellers during the famine years described how entire clusters of cottages could become abandoned within a short time when families migrated elsewhere. Fields that once supported several households sometimes fell silent. You pass one such cottage now. The roof remains mostly intact, though the doorway stands open to the wind. Inside the hearth is cold and dark. The absence of daily life feels almost louder than sound. Further along the road, however, activity continues. A group of farmers gathers beside a field discussing the progress of the new potato plants. They kneel to examine leaves and stems carefully. For the moment, the crop looks strong. The weather has been mild. Rain has arrived in steady but gentle amounts. Everything appears favourable, yet a cautious mood still hangs over the conversation. One farmer explains that he checks his plants every morning, now looking for the dark spots that signalled the blight the previous year. Another says he has heard rumours that the disease may have disappeared entirely. The group exchanges uncertain glances. No one can say for sure. Agricultural observers at the time also watched the new crop closely. Early reports during the 1846 growing season suggested that potato plants across many regions were developing normally during the first months of growth. For farmers who had endured the previous year's loss, this early success brought a fragile sense of relief. You walk farther into the fields where the wind moves gently through the young plants. Their leaves rustle softly against one another. The sound carries a quiet promise of harvest. Children gather near the edge of the field collecting small stones while their parents work nearby. One boy points proudly to a row he helped plant earlier in the spring. He says those potatoes will grow the largest. His father smiles but says nothing. It is easy to see how hope begins returning. The land appears fertile again. The plants grow strong. Perhaps the worst has passed. Yet far beyond this quiet village, agricultural inspectors and scientists remain uneasy. The mysterious disease that devastated the previous harvest has not been fully understood. Without understanding its cause, predicting its return remains impossible. Modern historians continue exploring how the early success of the 1846 crop influenced public perception of the famine. Many farmers believed that the disaster of the previous year might prove temporary if the new harvest succeeded. This belief encouraged communities to invest once again in potato planting. You leave the fields and return towards the village as the afternoon sun spreads golden light across the valley. Smoke rises once more from the cottage chimneys. Inside those homes, families prepare simple meals and talk quietly about the future. Some speak of rebuilding their food stores if the harvest proves strong. Others still consider emigration just in case. For now, however, the young potato plants sway gently in the warm breeze. Their leaves shine bright green beneath the sky. And across Ireland, millions of farmers watch these fragile signs of life with cautious hope, praying that the land will finally reward their patience after the long and uncertain winter. Summer slowly settles over the countryside, bringing longer days and a softer warmth that spreads across the valley. When you walk out of the cottage early one morning, the air carries the sweet scent of grass and wildflowers growing along the hedgerows. Bees hum lazily among the blossoms while skylarks spiral high above the fields. At first glance, the land appears peaceful again. The potato plants have grown tall. Their green leaves spread thickly across the rows, forming the familiar blanket of foliage that farmers know so well. White blossoms have begun appearing at the tops of the plants, delicate flowers that signal healthy growth beneath the soil. You follow a narrow path between two fields where farmers pause to inspect the crop. The mood feels lighter than it has in many months. Several men lean against their spades while discussing the strength of the plants. One laughs quietly and says the potatoes might grow so large this year that they will need bigger baskets to harvest them. The joke draws a ripple of relaxed smiles. Moments of humour, even gentle ones like this, carry surprising importance during difficult periods. Laughter allows people to step briefly away from the weight of constant worry. You sit on a stone wall while the conversation continues. One farmer recalls a story from years earlier when a pig wandered into his neighbour's potato field and managed to eat half the crop before anyone noticed. The story becomes more exaggerated with each retelling. By the end, the pig has grown nearly as large as a horse. The men laugh openly now. Small stories like these travel easily through rural communities, especially during long hours spent working in the fields. They offer a simple way to pass time and maintain spirits. The countryside itself appears vibrant. Butterflies drift between patches of clover. A gentle breeze ripples through the tall grass along the lane. From a distance, the valley looks almost untouched by hardship. Yet beneath the laughter and sunlight, people remain watchful. You notice how often farmers kneel to examine the leaves of their potato plants. Fingers brush carefully along the stems, searching for any sign of the dark stains that mark the blight the previous year. So far, the leaves remain bright green. This early success has encouraged cautious optimism across many rural areas. Agricultural reports from the summer of 1846 describe the potato crop as healthy and abundant during the early growing months. The plants developed normally, and many farmers began anticipating a strong harvest. This encouraging growth created a powerful sense of relief after the anxiety of the previous season. You walk farther along the field where children are gathering near a patch of wild berries growing along the hedge. Their hands are stained purple from picking fruit. One girl proudly holds up a small basket filled with berries and announces that her mother will bake them into a pie. Berries, apples, and other seasonal foods sometimes added welcome variety to diets dominated by potatoes. Even a small handful of fruit could brighten a family meal. Nearby, a man attempts to repair a broken fence rail while his dog sits patiently beside him. The dog occasionally chases a butterfly only to return moments later as if embarrassed by its own enthusiasm. Scenes like this remind you that ordinary life continues alongside hardship. You wander toward the edge of the field where several farmers discuss weather patterns. One man believes the recent rains have been exactly what the potatoes needed. Another points toward distant clouds and hopes the storms stay gentle rather than heavy. Weather plays a crucial role in agriculture. Farmers often study the sky with careful attention, reading subtle clues about the days ahead. Scholars studying the famine often examine how the weather conditions of 1846 created an environment that initially supported strong potato growth. Warm temperatures combined with sufficient rainfall allowed the plants to flourish during the early summer. For many farmers, the healthy fields seem to promise redemption. You notice one older man standing slightly apart from the others. He studies the plants quietly without joining the laughter. When you approach, he explains that he remembers hearing about crop diseases that returned after disappearing for a single season. His caution reflects a lingering unease shared by some experienced farmers. Hope has returned, but it is tempered by memory. As afternoon sunlight brightens the valley, the farmers eventually return to their work. Tools strike the soil with steady rhythm. Children carry baskets of berries back toward the cottages. The breeze continues moving gently through the fields of green potato plants. You pause once more at the edge of the field and look across the countryside. The landscape appears full of life. For a brief moment, it feels possible that the coming harvest will restore stability to the village. But hidden among the leaves and stems of these thriving plants lies a quiet uncertainty. Because the blight that struck the previous year has not been defeated. It has only been waiting. And somewhere beyond the hills, carried by wind and moisture, through the warm summer air, the invisible spores of the disease are already beginning their journey back toward the fields of Ireland. Late summer settled gently over the countryside. The hedgerows grow thick and tangled, and the air hums with insects moving lazily through the warm sunlight. When you walk along the narrow lane outside the village, the potato plants still appear strong, their green leaves spreading wide across the fields. Yet something about the landscape has quietly changed. You notice it when you pass the row of cottages near the bend in the road. Several of them stand empty now. Their doors hang open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Grass has begun creeping across the small yards where children once played. A broken wooden bucket lies near one doorway, half buried in weeds. The absence of life feels unmistakable. Earlier in the year, these homes were filled with families, preparing meals, tending gardens, and sharing conversation beside the hearth. Now the silence remains. Across Ireland during the famine years, many villages experienced gradual population loss as families migrated in search of work relief or passage overseas. Some departures happened quietly, with neighbours leaving during the night or early morning to avoid drawing attention. Others were more visible, marked by carts loaded with belongings and tearful farewells along the road. You step closer to one abandoned cottage and peer inside. The hearth sits dark and empty. A wooden stool rests near the wall where someone once sat preparing potatoes for supper. Dust has begun settling across the floor. Scenes like this became increasingly common in rural areas as the famine progressed. You continue walking along the lane until you reach the small crossroads where villagers often gather to exchange news. Today, only a few people stand there leaning against the stone wall while watching the sky. The conversation turns toward the families who have left. One man explains that his cousin travelled to Liverpool earlier in the summer, hoping to find work in the docks. Another says he heard that several neighbours boarded a ship bound for Canada. Stories of departure now appear in almost every conversation. An interesting social detail noted in several contemporary letters describes how quickly rural communities adapted to these changes. With fewer families, remaining neighbours often took on additional responsibilities, helping to maintain fields or care for livestock belonging to relatives who had departed. You walk toward the fields where the potato plants sway gently in the warm breeze. At first they appear unchanged, but as you look more carefully, you notice that the farmers seem more watchful now. They move slowly along the rows, examining the leaves with careful attention. The memory of the previous year's blight remains fresh. One farmer lifts a leaf and studies it closely. Another kneels to inspect the base of a plant. Their actions reveal a quiet anxiety hidden beneath the calm surface of the summer landscape. Research into this period shows that even during seasons when crops initially appeared healthy, farmers often remained vigilant after experiencing earlier losses. The unpredictable nature of the blight created an atmosphere of constant observation. You sit on a low stone wall and listen to the wind moving softly through the plants. From this distance, the fields still look rich and full. The village behind you appears peaceful beneath the warm sunlight. Yet the missing families have left subtle gaps in the rhythm of daily life. Fewer voices drift along the lanes. Fewer children gather beside the stream. The schoolhouse near the church has fewer students attending lessons. Small changes accumulate quietly. You rise and walk toward the edge of the valley where the road curves toward the distant coast. From this vantage point, you can see the scattered cottages dotting the hillsides. Some remain active with smoke rising from their chimneys. Others sit empty and silent. Scholars examining population patterns during the famine years often note that migration rarely occurred all at once. Instead, villages experienced gradual waves of departure as conditions worsened and opportunities elsewhere appeared. The result was a slow reshaping of rural landscapes. Communities that once felt crowded with families and livestock began to thin. You return toward the village as afternoon shadows stretch across the fields. A cart passes along the lane carrying two young men and several bundles tied with rope. They nod politely as they travel past. Their destination is likely the nearest port. You watch the cart disappear over the hill. Behind you, the potato plants continue rustling softly in the breeze. Their leaves remain green. Their stems appear strong. The coming harvest still holds the promise of relief. But the village itself is no longer quite the same. With each passing month, the quiet departures of neighbours have begun leaving lasting marks on the community. And before long, those changes will grow even more visible as the famine's deeper consequences unfold across the countryside. Late summer begins drifting toward autumn, and the countryside slowly changes colour. The bright greens of the fields soften into deeper shades, and the air carries the faint scent of drying grass and ripening crops. When you step outside the cottage one morning, the sky stretches wide and pale above the hills, with thin clouds moving lazily across the horizon. From a distance, the valley still looks peaceful, but when you walk toward the potato fields, something feels wrong. You notice it first in the behaviour of the farmers. Several of them are already moving quickly between the rows, their faces tense. Instead of the relaxed conversations you heard earlier in the summer, their voices now carry urgency. You follow one farmer as he bends over a plant and lifts a leaf toward the light. Dark patches spread across its surface. The edges of the leaf appear damp and slightly shriveled. Your stomach tightens. The blight has returned. Across Ireland during the late summer of 1846, the potato crop once again fell victim to the same disease that had devastated fields the previous year. Many farmers who had hoped for recovery watched in dismay as the healthy plants began deteriorating rapidly. You walk deeper into the field where the signs grow more obvious. Leaves that looked vibrant only days earlier now appear spotted and fragile. Some stems have collapsed entirely, causing the plants to droop toward the soil. The smell of decay drifts faintly through the air. A farmer pulls a plant from the ground and cuts open one of the potatoes beneath it. The inside shows the familiar brown rot. He closes his eyes for a moment before tossing the ruined tuber aside. The reaction spreads quickly across the field. Several farmers begin digging frantically, hoping to salvage any potatoes that have not yet been affected. The pace of their work grows faster with each passing minute. This sudden shift from hope to alarm echoes scenes described in many contemporary reports from the time. The 1846 crop had appeared healthy through much of the growing season, making the return of the blight particularly devastating. You stand beside the stone wall and watch the frantic harvesting. Men and women move quickly through the rows, pulling plants from the soil and sorting potatoes into baskets. Children carried the baskets toward waiting carts. Every healthy potato now feels precious, but as the digging continues, the pattern becomes painfully clear. Many of the tubers show signs of rot. Some appear healthy at first glance, but reveal dark streaks when cut open. The blight has spread again. A farmer nearby shakes his head slowly. He says that he has never seen a disease move through crops with such speed. Agricultural observers at the time often expressed similar astonishment. The potato blight could destroy entire fields within a matter of days under favourable weather conditions. Cool temperatures combined with moist air created the perfect environment for the disease to thrive. You walk to the edge of the field where a small group of farmers has gathered to discuss what to do next. One suggests digging every remaining potato immediately before the rot spreads further. Another believes the crop is already beyond saving. Their voices carry exhaustion more than anger. The previous year's disappointment had been difficult. This second failure feels crushing. You look across the valley and notice that similar activity is happening in neighbouring fields. Farmers everywhere are rushing to harvest what they can. Carts move slowly along the roads, carrying sacks of potatoes that may or may not remain edible for long. In many regions during the autumn of 1846, the second year of blight proved even more destructive than the first. Fields that had offered hope during the summer suddenly produced very little usable food. The impact spread quickly through rural communities already weakened by the earlier crop failure. You sit quietly on the stone wall as the frantic digging continues. The sound of shovels striking soil echoes across the field. Baskets fill and empty again. Occasionally, someone cuts open a potato only to discard it moments later. Nearby, a child watches silently while holding a small sack. He had likely imagined that this harvest would restore the family's food supply for the coming winter. Now he sees the disappointment on the faces of the adults around him. The afternoon sun moves slowly across the sky while the farmers continue their desperate work. By evening, the field looks torn apart. Rows of plants lie scattered across the ground. Small piles of spoiled potatoes sit beside larger sacks containing those that might still be edible. You stand and look across the valley once more. The countryside appears almost unchanged from a distance. Green fields still stretch toward the hills. Cottages still stand beside narrow lanes. But within those fields, the second great failure of the potato crop has already begun reshaping the lives of everyone who depends on this land. And this time the consequences will reach far deeper than before. The weeks following the second ruined harvest pass under a heavy silence. When you walk through the village now, the familiar sounds of everyday life feel quieter than before. Fewer carts travel along the lanes. Fewer voices carry across the fields. Even the dogs seem to bark less often, as if sensing the weight that has settled over the countryside. You step outside one morning and notice a thin fog drifting slowly across the valley. The air smells damp and cool, mixed with the faint sour scent of rotting vegetation left behind in the fields. The potato plants have mostly collapsed now. What once looked like strong rows of green leaves has turned into a patchwork of dark stems and flattened foliage. The harvest that farmers hoped would restore their food supply has largely failed again. You walk along the path toward the fields where several men stand beside a cart filled with sacks. But these sacks look smaller than they should. When one is opened, the contents reveal a discouraging truth. Many of the potatoes inside show signs of decay. A farmer lifts one in his hand and cuts it open with a knife. Brown rot spreads through the flesh. He drops it back into the sack without speaking. By the autumn of 1846, the potato blight had spread across vast areas of Ireland, destroying a large portion of the crop for the second consecutive year. For millions of people whose diets depended heavily on potatoes, the consequences became increasingly severe. You watch as the farmers quietly sort through the sacks, separating the few healthy potatoes from those already spoiled. The piles of usable food grow slowly. The piles of rotten potatoes grow faster. Nearby, a woman spreads several potatoes on a cloth near the road, hoping the sunlight might slow the rot long enough for them to be eaten. Small strategies like this appear everywhere now. People attempt drying potatoes, slicing away damaged portions, or cooking them quickly before the decay spreads further. You continue walking toward the edge of the village, where a group of men has gathered beside the crossroads. Their conversation centres on the future. One suggests that farmers may need to begin planting other crops next year, such as turnips, barley, or oats. Another explains that his land is too small to produce enough grain to support his family. The limitations of tenant farming remain clear. Large-scale crop diversification requires space and resources that many rural households simply do not possess. One curious observation, preserved in agricultural reports from the period, describes how some farmers attempted to grow unfamiliar crops during the famine years, sometimes experimenting with vegetables they had never cultivated before. Results varied widely. Some fields produced modest success. Others failed due to poor soil conditions or lack of experience with the new plants. You walk farther along the road and notice that more cottages now stand abandoned. Their empty doorways face the wind like silent witnesses to the changes sweeping through the countryside. Grass grows tall in the yards where children once played. A wooden cartwheel leans against one wall, left behind by a family who likely departed in haste. The slow transformation of the landscape continues. You pause beside one cottage where a small apple tree still stands in the garden. Its branches hang heavy with fruit. A few villagers have gathered there, collecting the apples carefully into baskets. Fruit trees, though not capable of feeding entire families, offer welcome additions to the dwindling food supply. The apples will likely be eaten fresh or boiled into simple dishes. Small harvests like this now carry increased importance. Scholars examining rural diets during the famine years often note that communities began relying more heavily on any available food sources, including wild plants, garden vegetables, and fruit when possible. You continue walking as the afternoon light fades slowly behind the hills. Smoke rises thinly from the remaining cottages where families prepare modest evening meals. Inside one home, you sit near the hearth while supper cooks in a small iron pot. The meal consists of cabbage oats and a few carefully chosen potatoes that appear free from rot. The portion is smaller than it once would have been, but the warmth of the fire still fills the room with comfort. Outside the window, the wind moves softly through the damaged fields. You hear the faint creak of a cart passing along the distant road. Perhaps another family is leaving. Perhaps someone is travelling to town in search of work or food. The uncertainty surrounding the future now touches every household. Researchers who study the long arc of the famine often point to the second great crop failure as the moment when hope began fading for many rural communities. After 2 consecutive seasons of blight, it became clear that the crisis would not end quickly. You step outside into the cool evening air. The sky above the valley glows with the fading colours of sunset. The land stretches quietly before you. Fields that once promised abundance now hold little food. Cottages that once echoed with voices now stand silent. Yet life continues here even amid the uncertainty. And as winter begins approaching once more, the people who remain must find new ways to endure the difficult months ahead. Autumn fades slowly into another winter, and the valley settles beneath a quiet grey sky once more. When you step outside the cottage early one morning, the air feels colder than it did only a few weeks ago. The wind carries the damp scent of fallen leaves and distant peat smoke drifting across the hills. The countryside appears subdued. Where summer once filled the fields with green growth, and busy farmers, winter now brings long stretches of stillness. The soil rests again beneath a thin crust of frost, waiting for another season that may or may not bring better fortune. You walk along the familiar lane that winds between the cottages. But the village looks different now. More homes stand empty than before. Some cottages still show signs of life with smoke curling gently from their chimneys. Others sit dark and quiet, their windows hollow and their doors swinging loosely in the wind. The slow transformation of the community has become impossible to ignore. A detail frequently noted by observers during the famine years is how rapidly rural populations declined as migration increased. Some villages lost large portions of their residents within only a few seasons. The changes reshaped both the social life and the physical landscape of the countryside. You pause beside one abandoned cottage, where the roof has begun sagging under the weight of damp straw. Moss creeps across the stone walls, and a broken chair lies near the doorway. Inside the hearth remains black with soot from countless fires that once warmed the room. Now it stands silent. You continue walking toward the small stream where children once gathered to play during warmer months. Today the water flows quietly beneath a thin layer of ice. No voices echo along the banks, yet memory lingers in places like this. You remember the laughter of children racing sticks along the current. You remember the smell of cooking fires drifting from nearby cottages. You remember the sound of neighbours greeting one another along the road. Those moments have not disappeared completely, but they have become fewer. You cross the stone bridge and climb the small hill overlooking the valley. From here, the view stretches wide across the land. Fields lie open and quiet. Stone walls trace their familiar lines across the hillsides. Clusters of cottages sit scattered like small islands among the pastures. Yet the spaces between them feel larger now. Scholars studying the demographic effects of the famine continue exploring how migration illness and declining birth rates combined to reduce Ireland's population during the mid-19th century. The transformation did not occur all at once. Instead, it unfolded gradually as each year brought new challenges. You sit on the low wall and watch the clouds moving slowly across the sky. The winter wind carries distant sounds along the valley. A cart rattles faintly along the road toward town. A dog barks somewhere near the far hillside. Even in quieter times, life continues. You eventually walk back toward the village where a few remaining families gather near the crossroads. Someone has lit a small fire there to warm their hands. The flames flicker gently while the group shares news and conversation. One man mentions hearing that some immigrants who left earlier have begun sending letters and small amounts of money home. Another says he is considering the journey himself next spring. The discussion feels thoughtful rather than hurried. Decisions now carry greater weight than ever before. An interesting social pattern observed in several historical records involves how communities maintained connections with relatives who had emigrated. Letters, remittances, and occasional returning travellers helped create networks that linked rural Irish villages with distant cities across the Atlantic. Those connections would grow stronger in the years ahead. You return to the cottage as evening approaches. Inside, the fire burns steadily in the hearth while supper cooks slowly in the pot. The meal remains simple, a mixture of oats, cabbage, and a few remaining potatoes. Everyone eats quietly, listening to the wind moving outside. Later that night, you step outside once more. The sky above the valley is clear, filled with bright winter stars. Their light reflects faintly off the frost covering the fields. The land appears calm, but beneath that calm lies the memory of everything that has happened over the past 2 years. The failed harvests, the empty cottages, the families who walked away along the roads. Those memories will remain long after the famine itself begins to ease. And for the people who lived through these seasons, the experience will shape how they see the land, their community, and the future for many years to come. Another quiet evening settles across the valley. The sky fades slowly from pale blue to deep indigo as the last light slips behind the hills. You step outside the cottage and breathe in the cool night air, noticing how the countryside now feels calmer than it did during those first months of uncertainty. The wind moves gently through the hedgerows. From somewhere down the road comes the faint creak of a cart returning home. Smoke rises in thin grey lines from the few cottages that remain occupied, drifting upward until it disappears among the stars. You walk slowly along the familiar lane one more time. The path feels well known beneath your feet. Over the past years, you have watched this place change in quiet but lasting ways. Some homes remain warm and full of life. Others sit empty, their stone walls holding the memory of families who once gathered around hearth fires inside. Yet the land itself endures. Fields stretch across the valley just as they always have. The stone walls still trace their winding patterns along the hillsides. The small stream continues its steady journey beneath the old bridge where children once floated sticks in the current. Time moves forward even after difficult seasons. One widely accepted historical truth is that the famine transformed Ireland in ways that lasted far beyond the years of immediate crisis. Population numbers declined significantly, and patterns of migration altered the structure of many rural communities. Villages that once seemed crowded with families and livestock became quieter places. But life did not disappear. You walk toward the edge of the field where the soil lies dark beneath the night sky. In the months ahead, farmers will return here again with their spades and seed potatoes. Planting will begin once more. The land has always required patience. Each season brings its own uncertainties. Rain may come too heavily. Frost may arrive too early. Crops may flourish or fail. Yet generation after generation continues working the same soil. You sit on the low stone wall and listen to the peaceful sounds of the countryside at night. An owl calls from somewhere near the trees. The breeze rustles softly through dry grass. The quiet feels deeper now, almost comforting. Some historians have reflected on how communities that endured the famine carried its memory forward for decades. Stories of hardship, resilience, and migration passed from one generation to the next, shaping how people understood their past. Those stories remain woven into the identity of the land itself. You imagine the travellers who left this valley during those difficult years. Some boarded ships bound for distant cities across the ocean. Others moved to growing towns within Ireland. Letters travelled back and forth across the Atlantic, carrying news of new lives built far from these hills. In many cases, the connections remained strong. Families separated by oceans continued writing, sending small amounts of money, and remembering the places they once called home. The quiet fields surrounding you tonight hold those memories. They remember the laughter of children running through the grass. They remember the farmers who knelt in the soil planting potatoes with careful hands. They remember the carts that creaked slowly down the road carrying families toward uncertain futures. Yet they also remember the strength of the people who remained. Life in rural Ireland did not simply vanish after the famine. Communities adapted. Farms changed. New generations grew up among the same hills and fields, learning both the beauty and the hardships of the land. The night grows deeper as you continue sitting beside the stone wall. A gentle calm settles across the valley. You breathe in the cool air and watch the stars slowly wheel above the quiet countryside. The world moves forward just as it always has. And the story of these fields, these cottages, and the people who lived among them becomes part of a much larger human journey. So now, as the firelight glows softly behind the cottage windows and the wind whispers across the dark fields, you can let the sounds of this old Irish valley fade gently into the distance. The roads grow quiet. The fields rest beneath the stars. And the long story of life during the famine settles into memory like a distant echo carried on the night air. Sleep well. Now the pace slows. The wind softens across the valley and the quiet countryside drifts into a gentler stillness. Imagine yourself standing once more on that low hill above the fields. The cottages below glow faintly with firelight, their warm windows flickering softly against the darkness. The world has grown peaceful again. You can hear the stream moving beneath the old stone bridge, its water flowing steadily through the valley just as it has for centuries. The hedgerows rustle quietly in the breeze, and somewhere far away, an owl calls once before the night becomes silent again. The land rests now. Fields that once carried rows of potatoes lie calm beneath the stars, waiting patiently for another spring. The soil remembers the hands that worked it, the seasons of hope and disappointment, the families who lived and dreamed beside these quiet hills. But tonight there is no urgency, only stillness. You breathe in the cool night air and feel the calm settling around you. The worries of the past drift away like mist across the valley. The stars above continue their slow journey through the sky. The cottages grow quiet as the last lamps are extinguished and families settle into sleep beside the fading warmth of their hearth fires. Even the wind grows softer. And in this peaceful darkness, the story of this small village fades gently into memory. So let your mind drift slowly now, just like the quiet stream beneath the bridge. The hills remain, the fields endure, and the night wraps the valley in calm. Sweet dreams.